Welcome to Haunted Voice Channel. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, there are minimal ads in this video. If you enjoy the content, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps me create more stories for you. Also, I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching. I hope you enjoy the stories, and thank you so much for tuning in. Now, let's get started. I've got a story for you. One that's kept me awake on more than a few nights since it happened. It's not the kind of thing you can just shake off. The woods have a way of creeping into your bones, especially when something there wants you to remember. I can't say if what we experienced was real or if it was all in our heads, but you can decide for yourself. It was early spring, and 3 of us decided to go camping. Me, my buddy Eric, and his girlfriend Laura. We had this tradition every year. Find a new spot, hike as far as we could, and spend a long weekend in the middle of nowhere surrounded by trees and nothing else. That year we picked a place called Dark Hollow. The name should have been enough of a warning, but it was marked on the map as an untamed section of the state forest, so it sounded perfect for what we wanted. Total isolation. We set off early one Friday morning, our packs filled with supplies, and the weather was brisk but manageable. It took us most of the day to reach the spot, a small clearing surrounded by dense forest, with a little stream running nearby. We set up our tents, got a fire going, and settled in for a night under the stars. Everything felt right. Peaceful, even. Around midnight, the wind picked up, and a low fog rolled in. I didn't think much of it at first, but then I noticed something odd. The fog wasn't coming from the ground like you'd expect. It seemed to flow in from between the trees, like it was being pulled toward our campsite, surrounding us. It made the air heavy and the temperature drop suddenly. Laura joked that it felt like a scene from a horror movie, and we all laughed it off, trying to ignore the creeping chill in the air. We sat by the fire for a while, talking, sharing stories, the way you do when you're out there, away from everything. Then, right in the middle of a story Eric was telling, we all heard it. A slow, rhythmic thudding sound. At first it was distant, like someone pounding on a hollow log, but then it grew louder, closer. We stopped talking and listened. Thump, 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 and it was too steady to be an animal, too deliberate. Probably some woodpecker or something, Eric said, but his voice didn't sound convinced. Laura shot him a look that said, "Don't joke about this." And we all sat there staring into the dark woods, trying to figure out what could be making that noise. The fire crackled, and the fog seemed to close in tighter around us. Then came the laughter. It was soft at first, a light, almost playful giggle like a child hiding behind the trees. My stomach dropped when I heard it. It sounded too human, too familiar, but also not right. The sound was coming from the woods just beyond the edge of our clearing, echoing through the trees, making it impossible to tell exactly where it was coming from. "Okay, not funny," Laura said, standing up and pointing her flashlight into the woods. The beam cut through the fog, illuminating nothing but more trees. Eric grabbed his own light and shined it in the opposite direction. Nothing. We were surrounded by the shadows of tall pines and the thickening fog, and the giggling seemed to move around us, as if circling the camp. I felt a cold sweat prickling the back of my neck. "Let's just go in the tents," I suggested. "It's probably just some weird acoustics, the wind carrying sounds from a long way off." Eric nodded, trying to look brave, but I could see the unease in his eyes. We all crawled into our tents, zipped them shut, and huddled in our sleeping bags. But the thumping and giggling didn't stop. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening to the sounds moving in and out of the woods, sometimes close, sometimes far away, always shifting. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just the woods playing tricks. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I finally dozed off at some point, but I woke up suddenly to Laura's voice, low and scared. "Guys, do you hear that?" I sat up, and it took me a second to realize what she meant. It wasn't the laughter or the thumping this time. It was something else. Whispering, right outside the tent. It was soft, so soft you had to strain to hear it, but it was there. Low, hurried voices, like a conversation happening just outside, inches away from where we lay. I couldn't make out any words, but the tone was frantic, like whoever or whatever was speaking was arguing or maybe pleading. Eric was dead silent, and I could feel Laura shaking beside him. We were all frozen, too scared to unzip the tent and look. The voices grew louder, more desperate, and then came something worse, a scraping sound like fingernails dragging across the fabric of the tent, slowly, deliberately, making its way from one side of the tent to the other and then back again. My breath hitched in my throat, and I held onto the zipper, praying it would hold. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The whispering, the scraping, everything, gone, like someone had flipped a switch. We sat there, holding our breath, listening to the deafening silence. After what felt like forever, Eric whispered, "We need to go. Now." It was still dark, but we didn't care. We packed up our things as fast as we could, barely bothering to roll up the tents properly, just stuffing everything into our packs. I could see the fear on everyone's faces, the way their hands shook as they fumbled with buckles and straps. And then we heard it again, something moving in the woods, crashing through the trees, coming toward us. Fast. We bolted. Headlamps on, packs half secured, we ran down the trail, stumbling over roots and rocks, the sound of something, or someone, chasing us from the foggy woods. I don't know how long we ran, but eventually the trees thinned and we broke out into a clearing where the trail widened. We didn't stop until we saw the faint blue-gray light of dawn, the first signs that morning was coming. We didn't look back. We just kept moving, walking all the way back to the car in silence until we were sure we were far enough away. None of us spoke a word the entire drive home. A couple of weeks later, curiosity got the better of me, and I looked up Dark Hollow online. What I found was a small article buried in an old newspaper archive, a mention of a logging town that used to be in those woods back in the late 1800s. The town had burned down in a fire that spread through the forest, killing most of its inhabitants, including several children who couldn't escape in time. But what really chilled me was one line at the bottom of the article, a local legend that had persisted long after the fire, about a ghostly presence in the woods. They called it the Keeper of the Hollow, a spirit that was said to lure campers off the trail with sounds of laughter, whispers, and the rhythmic thumping of ghostly axes. It's probably just a story, but after that weekend I don't care to find out. None of us ever went back to Dark Hollow, and I don't think we ever will. I can still hear that laughter sometimes, in my dreams, echoing from somewhere deep in the fog. Thump, thump, thump. I never used to be afraid of the dark. I loved camping, loved the quiet serenity of being out in nature, away from the hum of technology and the suffocating pace of city life. But after that night in the Catskills, something inside me changed. The dark now feels like an invitation for something to find me again. It was a weekend trip, just me and two of my oldest friends, Chris and Becca. We'd planned it for weeks, an escape into the mountains to unplug, reset, and get away from everything. The Catskills were perfect for it. Miles of wilderness, no cell service, just the dense towering trees and the crisp autumn air. I didn't know that same isolation I craved would become my worst nightmare. We set up camp deep in the woods, far from any marked trails. Chris had found this spot through some obscure forum, practically untouched by hikers, he said. It was the kind of place that felt ancient, like the trees had been watching over it for centuries. The first day was normal, peaceful even. We pitched our tent by a clearing where we could watch the sunset over the mountains. We spent the evening talking, laughing, and cooking over the fire. By the time the stars came out, the three of us were already a little tipsy on cheap whiskey, the fire crackling as it threw flickering shadows across the campsite. It wasn't until the fire started to die down that I noticed something strange. The woods, which had been alive with the sounds of insects and rustling leaves, had gone unnervingly quiet. At first I thought it was just my imagination, the alcohol playing tricks on me. But Chris noticed it too. "Is it just me, or did everything go dead silent all of a sudden?" he asked, squinting into the darkness like he was trying to see something just out of reach. Becca laughed it off, brushing it aside as nighttime jitters. "We're in the middle of nowhere, guys. Nature isn't exactly on a schedule." She threw another log on the fire, but the nervous edge in her voice gave her away. I wanted to believe her, but something about that silence felt wrong. You don't realize how loud the forest is until it stops. No wind, no crickets, no distant rustling of animals. Just a wall of stillness pressing in on us from all sides. I tried to shake it off, blaming the booze and the isolation for getting under my skin. We crawled into the tent, huddled in our sleeping bags, and settled in for the night. But sleep wouldn't come. The quiet gnawed at me, making the darkness feel thicker, like it was closing in. Then, just as I was about to drift off, I heard it. A faint sound, distant at first, like footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Something, or someone, was moving through the woods, just beyond our campsite. I strained my ears, holding my breath, listening for any sign that I was wrong. But there it was again. Crunch, crunch, the unmistakable sound of feet pressing down on dry leaves. I thought it might be an animal, but something about the rhythm felt too human. I turned over to whisper to Chris, but before I could say anything, he sat up abruptly, his eyes wide, his face pale in the dim light of the tent. "You hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, my stomach twisting into knots. Becca stirred, muttering something groggy, but when she saw our faces, she froze. The footsteps were getting closer, slow, unhurried, like whoever or whatever was out there wasn't in a rush, like it knew we were listening. Chris grabbed the flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. He flicked the light on and the beam cut through the thick darkness, but there was nothing. Just the trees, standing tall and unmoving. "Nothing there," he muttered more to himself than to us, but his voice was shaky. He zipped the tent back up, lying down stiffly, the flashlight still clutched in his hand. We sat there in silence, our ears straining for any more sounds. For a long time, there was nothing. Just the heavy, oppressive quiet that seemed to swallow up the world outside. Then came the whisper. It was so soft, so faint, I almost didn't catch it. But it was there, drifting through the trees like a sigh carried on the wind. A voice, but distorted, like it was being filtered through a bad radio frequency. "Let me in." I shot upright, my heart hammering in my chest. Chris whipped his head toward me, his eyes wide with fear. Becca let out a small, stifled gasp. "What the hell was that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't answer, I couldn't. I just stared at the tent wall, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I'd heard. It couldn't be real. It couldn't be. But then it came again, louder this time. The same 3 words, stretched out in a horrible, guttural drawl. "Let me in." The voice was closer now, right outside the tent. I could hear the fabric of the tent flutter slightly, as if something was pressing against it from the other side. I reached for the knife I'd packed with my gear, my hands trembling as I wrapped my fingers around the hilt. Chris turned the flashlight on again, and this time he unzipped the tent flap fully, shining the light out into the clearing. There, just beyond the circle of light, was a figure. It stood between the trees, its body unnaturally tall, limbs too long and thin, its skin a sickly pale gray. Its eyes, or what should have been eyes, were just empty, black holes, staring at us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Its mouth hung open, wider than any human mouth could, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. And it was smiling. It didn't move, it just stood there, grinning at us with that impossible mouth, its hollow eyes locked onto the tent. Then, slowly, its head tilted to one side, the bones in its neck cracking with the motion. And in that same distorted voice, it whispered again, "Let me in." I don't remember much after that. Everything happened so fast. Chris screamed, Becca was crying, and I was fumbling to get the knife out, my hands shaking so hard I nearly dropped it. But by the time I looked up again, the thing was gone. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. We sat huddled together, watching the entrance of the tent, waiting for it to come back. But it never did. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, we packed up as fast as we could and got the hell out of there. None of us spoke on the hike back to the car. There was nothing to say. We never reported what happened. Who would believe us? Just another group of campers spooked by the woods, right? But something followed us out of that forest. I know it did. Sometimes, late at night when I'm lying in bed, I can still hear it, soft, almost imperceptible. Let me in. And I know that one day it's going to find me again. The fire crackled softly in front of me, sending sparks up into the cool night air. The towering pines around the clearing loomed like silent sentinels, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, a break from the chaos of city life. Just me, the trees, and the stars. But something felt wrong. It started earlier that afternoon. I'd been hiking for most of the day, making my way deeper into the heart of Blackwood Forest. It wasn't a well-traveled area, which is exactly what I wanted. I'd heard stories about people getting lost here, about strange occurrences, but I chalked it up to local legends meant to scare tourists. After all, forests are full of noises. Creatures scurry through the underbrush, branches snap, the wind howls through the trees. It's easy to let your imagination run wild. But this was different. I first noticed the silence. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. It wasn't just the absence of birds or animals. It was like the forest itself had stopped breathing. The usual sounds of nature, the wind, the leaves, the occasional rustle were gone. It felt unnatural, and with it came a sensation I couldn't quite place, a feeling like I was being watched, not by an animal, but by something intelligent, something that understood I was there, alone. By the time I found a clearing to set up camp, the sun was already dipping below the horizon. The sky had taken on that eerie twilight glow, where the light is just enough to see, but the shadows seemed darker, more oppressive. As I started building my fire, that sense of unease deepened. I told myself it was just nerves, that I was psyching myself out. But then I saw it. Just beyond the tree line, something moved. It was quick, almost too fast for me to register, but I caught a glimpse. A shape, human-like, but not quite right. It disappeared as quickly as it had come, slipping behind the trees before I could focus on it. I froze, staring at the spot where it had vanished, my heart thudding in my chest. Was it just a trick of the light? Maybe an animal? A deer? Or a bear? But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I'd seen wasn't either of those things. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but my hands were shaking as I finished setting up camp. The fire eventually took hold, the flames casting flickering light against the darkening woods. I felt a little better with it burning in front of me, but that nagging sense of being watched never left. As the night wore on, the feeling only grew stronger. It was around midnight when the first sound came, a low, distant call, like something was trying to speak through the trees. At first I thought it was the wind, but it didn't ebb and flow like a breeze. It was too deliberate, too steady. I sat up, staring into the darkness, straining my ears to hear. There it was again, soft, guttural, like a voice carried on the wind. It sounded almost human, but wrong, distorted. "Hello?" I called out, more out of reflex than anything else. My voice sounded small, fragile against the vast, looming forest. The noise stopped, and for a moment I thought I might have scared it off. But then a new sound reached my ears. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, heavy. They crunched through the underbrush, circling the edge of my camp just beyond the light of the fire. I grabbed my flashlight, heart racing, and flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. The footsteps stopped as soon as the light hit the area, but the sensation of being watched intensified. I scanned the perimeter, my pulse thundering in my ears. "Who's there?" I shouted. No answer, just the sound of the fire crackling and my own ragged breathing. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but the trail back to my car was long, and hiking in the dark didn't seem like a smart move, especially with whatever was out there. I decided to stay by the fire, hoping that whatever it was would lose interest. But the forest wasn't done with me yet. Around 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of something, or someone, moving just outside my tent. It was a soft shuffling, like bare feet against leaves. My heart leapt into my throat. I reached for the flashlight, but as I flicked it on, the sound stopped again. I unzipped the tent slowly, trying not to make any noise. When I poked my head out, the fire had nearly burned down to embers. The forest was still, but the feeling of being watched was more intense than ever. I shined the flashlight around the campsite, its beam cutting through the shadows. And then I saw it. Standing just beyond the tree line, maybe 30 feet away, was a figure. It looked human, but its posture was all wrong, too tall, too thin. Its limbs elongated in a way that made my skin crawl. Its face. God, its face was pale and expressionless, like a mask. I froze, unable to breathe, unable to move. The figure stood there, perfectly still, watching me. It didn't blink, didn't move, just stared with those empty, hollow eyes. I felt my blood turn to ice. For what felt like hours, we stayed like that, locked in a silent, terrifying standoff. Then, without warning, it stepped back into the shadows, disappearing into the darkness, as if it had never been there at all. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I couldn't. I sat by the fire, keeping it alive, my back to the tent, staring into the trees. Every rustle, every snap of a twig set my heart racing. But I didn't see it again. By the time dawn broke, I was already packing up. I wasn't going to stay another minute in that place. As I slung my pack over my shoulders and started down the trail, I glanced back at the clearing one last time. That's when I saw the tracks. Bare, human-like footprints leading from the edge of the tree line directly to where my tent had been. But the thing that chilled me to the bone, the tracks didn't lead away, they just stopped, as if whatever had been watching me had vanished into thin air. I hiked out of that forest as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached the parking lot. When I got there, the same ranger I'd spoken to when I arrived was waiting by the trailhead. "Didn't expect you back so soon," he said with a curious look. "Something scare you off?" I didn't say anything, just shook my head and kept walking. But as I reached my car, he called out again. "Be careful out there next time," he said, his voice oddly flat. "The woods. They don't like to be disturbed." When I turned back to look at him, he was gone. No sign of him. No vehicle. Nothing. I've heard stories since then about Blackwood Forest, about strange figures, about people who go missing and are never found. I've never been back, and I never will. I've always been drawn to the solitude of the wilderness, the stillness, the quiet, no city noise, no distractions, just you and the world. That's why I volunteered for the solo camping trip deep in the national forest. I'd done these before, but this time felt different, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. Maybe it was the ranger's warning as I checked in at the station. He was older, grizzled, his eyes cold as he handed me the map. "Stick to the marked trails. If you hear anything at night, don't leave your tent. Don't try to follow it." It felt more like a threat than advice. I laughed it off, assuming he was just trying to spook me, some kind of initiation for the more remote trails. But his expression didn't change. "I'm serious," he said, gripping the edge of the map a little too tightly. "Things out there aren't always what they seem." I brushed it off. I wasn't one for campfire stories. Superstition had never really done much for me. But looking back, I should have listened. It took most of the day to reach my campsite, nestled in a remote area near a small mirror-like lake. Tall pines towered above, their branches intertwining like skeletal fingers against the pale afternoon sky. There was something unnerving about the way the trees loomed overhead, the way their trunks seemed to stretch too far into the darkening woods. But I set up camp, boiled some water for dinner, and settled in. By dusk, everything felt normal, the usual chirping of crickets, the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. But as the last light of the sun vanished behind the mountains, the forest fell unnaturally silent. No more crickets, no wind, nothing. Just dead, suffocating quiet. At first I welcomed it. I've always found peace in the silence, but this wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive, heavy, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself that isolation does weird things to the mind. But the stillness wasn't just in my head. I could feel it in my chest, a tightness that wouldn't go away. It was as if something was out there watching me. I didn't realize I'd been holding my breath until I heard the first sound. It was faint at first, barely a whisper on the breeze, but unmistakable. A distant cry, almost human, but not quite. It came from somewhere deep in the forest, far beyond the lake, echoing through the trees. I froze listening. There it was again, a little louder this time. The cry was drawn out, rising and falling like someone, or something, calling for help. I told myself it was probably an animal, a coyote or maybe even a mountain lion. But it didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. There was something wrong about it, something unnatural in the way it seemed to carry on the air, too long, too distorted. My skin prickled. I stood by the edge of the lake, squinting into the darkness beyond the tree line. The moon cast a faint glow over the water, but the woods were a wall of shadows, impenetrable and still. The cry came again, closer now. For a moment I considered packing up and leaving, but then, as if on cue, the sound stopped. Just like that. The silence that followed was deeper than before, a void that swallowed everything else. No wind, no movement, just the overwhelming sense that I was not alone. I turned back toward my tent, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. I wouldn't let some eerie sounds ruin my trip. I climbed into my sleeping bag and shut my eyes, trying to will myself to sleep. But the woods had other plans. Sometime in the middle of the night I woke up, my breath caught in my throat. Something was outside the tent. I could hear it. At first it was just a faint rustling, like footsteps, moving slowly around the perimeter. I held my breath, every muscle tensing. It didn't sound like an animal. The steps were deliberate, heavy. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was another camper, someone lost in the woods. But no one else was supposed to be out here. I was miles from the nearest trail. And whoever or whatever it was wasn't calling out for help. They just kept circling. I lay still, my heart hammering in my chest, straining to hear through the fabric of the tent. Then it spoke. A voice, soft and low, barely more than a whisper, but I could hear it clearly through the thin canvas walls. Come out. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Come out, Derek. My blood turned to ice. It knew my name. How could it know my name? I forced myself to stay silent, though my mind was screaming. I hadn't told anyone where I was going. No one knew I was here. And that voice, it didn't sound quite human. There was something off, something jagged about it. The voice called again, but this time it was different. It wasn't coming from outside the tent anymore. It was inside. I scrambled backward, slamming into the side of the tent as my heart leaped into my throat. But there was no one there. Nothing. The tent was empty. I could hear the voice again, faint, like it was coming from a distance now. Outside, in the woods. Come find me, Derek. I grabbed my flashlight, fumbling with the zipper of the tent, and I stumbled outside into the cold night air. The forest stretched out before me, quiet and endless, the trees swaying gently in the breeze that had returned without warning. I scanned the woods with my light, heart pounding in my ears. Nothing, just trees and shadows, and then I saw it. Standing at the edge of the lake, its back to me was a figure. Tall, thin, unnaturally still. Its head was tilted slightly to one side as if it were listening to something I couldn't hear. My flashlight flickered as I raised it, the beam barely cutting through the fog that had settled over the water. The figure turned slowly, unnaturally, like it wasn't used to moving its own limbs. And then I saw its face. It wasn't a person, not really. Its skin was stretched too tight over its bones, and its eyes, black, empty holes, bored into me. Its mouth twisted into a smile, too wide, too forced. "Come find me," it whispered again, though the sound wasn't coming from its mouth. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. My breath came in ragged gasps as I turned and ran, branches whipping at my face and arms as I crashed through the woods, heart hammering. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I don't know how long I ran. Maybe hours, maybe minutes. But when I finally stopped, gasping for breath, I found myself back at the lake. My campsite was gone, my tent, my gear, everything. The clearing where I'd set up camp was empty, as if I had never been there, and standing at the edge of the lake, watching me with those empty black eyes, was the figure. It didn't speak this time. It didn't need to. I already knew. The forest had claimed me, and I would never leave. I've always been a solo camper. There's something about the solitude of nature, far from the noise and chaos of civilization, that soothes me. So when I decided to take a trip deep into the remote reaches of Blackwood National Forest, I didn't think twice. I had my gear, a map, and an eagerness to disappear for a few days. It was the kind of place where cell service was non-existent, and the closest town was an hour's drive away, exactly what I wanted. I arrived at the trailhead late afternoon, the sun already casting long shadows through the towering pines. The forest here felt different, thicker. I chalked it up to the age of the woods, centuries-old trees standing sentinel, their trunks wide and gnarled. As I hiked deeper, I could feel a subtle shift in the air, like the forest itself was watching. But I ignored it. It's easy to spook yourself when you're alone. By dusk, I found a small clearing beside a creek and set up camp. The sound of the water was calming, and for a while, I just sat by the fire, listening to the wind rustle the leaves overhead. The peace was short-lived. I began to notice things, little things, that felt off. A few birds darted past my camp, squawking loudly, like they were fleeing something. I shrugged it off. Animals act strange sometimes. Then there were the sounds, distant, almost imperceptible at first. A snap of a twig, a rustle in the brush just outside the firelight. Probably a deer, I thought, or maybe a fox. But as the night deepened, the forest grew unnervingly quiet. The usual sounds of nightlife, crickets, owls, the occasional rustle of small creatures, were absent. It was as if the woods were holding their breath. My fire crackled, a sharp contrast to the stillness. That's when I heard it. Low, guttural breathing coming from the darkness. I stood, gripping my flashlight, and pointed it in the direction of the sound. Nothing, just trees and shadows. I tried to shake off the unease creeping up my spine, telling myself it was an animal. But the breath, it sounded too close, too human. I sat back down, but I couldn't relax. My eyes kept darting to the edges of the firelight, expecting something to lunge out from the blackness. Then a voice, raspy, barely audible, whispered from the darkness, "Help me!" My blood ran cold. I leapt to my feet again, shining the light in all directions. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I thought maybe someone was lost, maybe injured. But the voice, it didn't sound right. There was no emotion in it, no urgency, just a flat, hollow tone. I grabbed my pack and considered leaving right then, but I was miles deep into the woods, and hiking out in the dead of night didn't seem like the safest option. As I weighed my choices, I heard the voice again, closer this time. "Help me." Suddenly a flashlight beam cut through the darkness, and a man in a ranger's uniform stepped into my camp. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a worn face that looked like it had seen too many winters out here. Relief washed over me. "Thank God," I said, my voice shaky. I heard something. Someone. There's a person out there asking for help. The ranger's face didn't change. He just stared at me, his eyes hollow, as if he didn't fully understand what I was saying. Then, after a long pause, he said, "You need to leave. Now." "What? Why? What's going on?" He glanced around the dark woods, his expression unreadable. "You're not safe here." I didn't need to be told twice. I hastily packed up my things. All the while the ranger stood silently, watching. Something about his presence unnerved me, but I wasn't going to argue. As I slung my pack over my shoulder, I heard it again. "Help me." It was louder now, more insistent, and it was coming from the direction the ranger had come from. I turned toward the sound, my flashlight flickering as if it was struggling to stay on. "I need to—" "Don't." The ranger's voice was cold, firm. "It's not what you think." Before I could respond, the underbrush behind the ranger shifted. A figure emerged from the shadows, a woman, pale and gaunt, her eyes wide with terror. She was mouthing something, but no sound came out. I stepped back, heart pounding. Who is that?" The ranger turned slowly, and I saw something flicker in his expression. Fear. But it wasn't directed at the woman. No, it was like he was afraid of me seeing her. "Get out of here," he said through gritted teeth, but his voice wavered. I didn't move. Everything in me was screaming to run, but I was frozen in place, staring at the woman. Then her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, and her body, her entire body, started to contort, limbs bending at unnatural angles, joints snapping loudly in the silence. Her skin began to ripple, as if something was moving just beneath the surface. The ranger stepped back, his face pale. "Run." I didn't wait. I turned and bolted into the woods, not caring which direction I was heading. The sounds of cracking bones and that awful distorted voice echoed behind me. "Help me!" Branches whipped at my face and my lungs burned, but I didn't stop. I could hear footsteps, heavy, fast, gaining on me. But they weren't human. The thud of paws, the snapping of underbrush, something was chasing me. I stumbled into a small clearing, gasping for breath, when I saw him again. The ranger, standing at the edge of the clearing, his face half lit by the moon. But something was wrong. His eyes, they weren't human anymore. Too dark, too reflective. And his mouth was too wide, stretched into a grin that split his face. Before I could scream, he spoke, his voice a guttural growl. "You should have left." Behind him, shadows shifted, large figures moving on all fours, their eyes glowing in the darkness. They circled me slowly, teeth bared, and I realized the awful truth. The ranger hadn't been trying to protect me. He had been leading me deeper into their territory. The last thing I saw before everything went black was his grin widening, revealing rows of jagged, inhuman teeth. I woke up the next morning lying in the same clearing. My gear was gone, and the forest was eerily calm, as if nothing had happened. But the deep claw marks on the trees and the heavy footprints in the dirt told a different story. When I finally made it back to civilization, no one believed me. They said Blackwood Forest had been closed for years, ever since the rangers disappeared. But I know what I saw, and sometimes, late at night, I can still hear that voice, faint but unmistakable. "Help me." I don't think I'm going to make it out of here. If someone finds this, I hope it serves as a warning. Whatever they say, whatever you hear about this place, it's worse than you can imagine. I should have listened. I should have never come here. I thought it would be a simple solo trip, just me in the wilderness, a weekend to get away from it all. I've been hiking these mountains for years, always careful, always prepared. But this time I went further than I ever had before. Deeper into the woods, into the forgotten valley. Locals won't talk about it. The maps don't show the trails that lead here. But I'd heard the stories, whispers of a place where the trees are older than memory, where the forest itself seems to watch you. It sounded like the kind of thing urban legends are made of, and I've always been drawn to the places that others are afraid to go. So I set out early, the sky just starting to lighten as I hiked up the ridge that overlooked the valley. The air was crisp, fresh, and for the first few hours, it felt like any other trek I'd done a dozen times. But as I descended into the valley, things changed. At first, it was subtle. The birds stopped singing, the usual rustle of squirrels or the occasional deer, gone. The wind, which had been a gentle breeze, suddenly stilled, as if the valley had swallowed it whole. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting the stories get into my head. But then there were the trees. They were wrong. Too tall, too thick, their bark gnarled and twisted, as if something had been twisting them for centuries. The branches hung low, almost like arms reaching out, and the deeper I went, the closer together they seemed to grow, until the sky above was just a patchwork of shadows and faint flickering light. That's when I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, damp earth, a hint of rot, but as I continued on, it grew stronger, sour and metallic, like the scent of blood mixed with decay. It was coming from deeper in the valley, drawing me in despite the knot forming in my stomach. I should have turned back. I should have listened to my gut. But curiosity, or maybe something else, pulled me forward. I found the first sign of trouble near a clearing. It was a campsite. No, had been a campsite. A tent shredded to pieces, its fabric hanging in tatters from the trees like grotesque decorations. There were belongings scattered around, a backpack, a boot half buried in the dirt. No sign of the owner. I knelt to examine the tent, my hands trembling slightly. The tears in the fabric weren't made by any animal I knew. They were too clean, too precise, like something with claws or knives had ripped through it. And then I saw the prints, footprints but not quite human, too large, too deep. The toes, they weren't right. Longer, almost clawed, as if whatever made them was walking upright but wasn't human. A cold sweat broke out across my skin, and I stood up, scanning the clearing. The feeling of being watched was so intense I could barely breathe. Every shadow between the trees felt alive, shifting and twisting like something was moving just out of sight. And then I heard it, a low guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the very ground. It wasn't close, but it was close enough. I grabbed my pack and started back the way I came, heart pounding, telling myself I'd be out of the valley in a couple of hours. But the forest had other plans. The trail I'd come in on was gone. I swear I'd followed the same path, but the trees were different now, pressing in from all sides. It was like the valley had shifted around me. The branches above blocked out more light, plunging everything into a dull gray gloom. That's when the noises started. At first, it was distant, barely audible. A rustling in the bushes, the snap of a twig, the faintest hint of movement just beyond the corner of my eye. But every time I looked, there was nothing there. The silence that followed was worse, oppressive, heavy, as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then came the voices. They were faint, indistinct, but unmistakably human, whispering, echoing through the trees, too soft for me to make out the words. It sounded like my name. Eric? I froze. I hadn't heard anyone speak my name since I left town, and yet there it was, carried on the still air. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the darkening forest. The whisper came again, this time from behind me. Eric. It was my mother's voice, but she'd been dead for 5 years. My breath caught in my throat. I'd read about this kind of thing, disembodied voices mimicking loved ones. I didn't believe it. I didn't want to. But there it was, as real as the wind that wasn't blowing anymore. And then I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the tree line, barely visible in the gloom. It was tall, too tall, and thin, its body twisted and elongated, like something had stretched it beyond the limits of its skin. The face, it was wrong. Pale, featureless except for the eyes. Black, deep, hollow eyes that stared into me, unblinking, unfeeling. Its head tilted slowly, unnaturally, like it was studying me, mimicking human behavior but not understanding it. "Eric, come here." The voice, my mother's voice, came from that thing. My legs went cold, my mind screamed at me to run, but I was rooted in place, frozen by the sight of it, by the wrongness of it. The figure took a step forward, impossibly quiet, its limbs moving with an unsettling grace. That's when I ran. I don't remember the details. I don't remember how far I went, only that I ran until my legs burned and my lungs felt like they were going to burst. The forest around me blurred, the trees twisted, the shadows thickened, but no matter how far I went, I could still hear the voices. "Eric, come back." They were louder now, overlapping, changing. My mother. My father. Friends I hadn't seen in years. All of them calling for me, begging me to come back. I kept running, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were closer, always just behind me, just out of sight. By the time I collapsed, the sun was barely visible through the trees, a sickly orange glow filtering through the dense canopy. I was at the edge of the valley, but I wasn't safe. I knew that. Whatever was in there, whatever they were, they had followed me. And now, as the sun sets completely, the darkness comes alive with their voices again. I can hear them just beyond the tree line, whispering, laughing, watching. I don't know how much longer I have. My flashlight is dying and I can't risk moving in the dark. But I can feel them. They're close now. So close. If you find this, don't come looking for me. Don't follow my trail. Don't believe the whispers. The valley. It's alive. And it doesn't let go. It was supposed to be a weekend of relaxation. Just me and two of my closest friends, camping deep in the forest, far away from the chaos of the city. I don't know why we chose that forest, why we didn't listen to the rumors. Locals talked about strange sightings, unsettling disappearances, but we laughed it off. Cryptids, skinwalkers, all that supernatural nonsense. It was just stories, right? That's what we thought. Now, I wish we hadn't been so naive. We arrived in the late afternoon, sunlight casting a golden hue through the towering trees. The air smelled fresh, pure, untouched by civilization. A small clearing next to a creek seemed like the perfect spot to set up camp. It was quiet, save for the occasional rustling of leaves and the babbling water. Too quiet, in retrospect. After pitching the tents and gathering wood for the fire, the sun dipped below the horizon, and the forest quickly turned dark. It felt like the trees themselves closed in around us, their branches stretching like skeletal fingers over our camp. But I brushed off the creeping unease. We were safe. We had each other, a fire, and the stars above. We sat around the fire telling jokes and sharing stories, the flames flickering in the cool night air. But after a while the conversation lulled, and we all noticed it at once, the strange silence. The crickets had stopped chirping, the wind had died down, even the creek seemed to have stilled. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. "Did you guys hear that?" Dan, my friend, broke the silence. We listened. At first nothing. Then it came. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper from the darkness. It was too soft to make out, like a voice carried on the wind, but it wasn't the wind. It sounded wrong, like someone mimicking human speech but just missing the mark. We laughed it off, trying to ignore the chill creeping up our spines, assuming it was just the trees or our imaginations playing tricks. But it wasn't. The whispers continued just on the edge of our hearing, circling the camp. I could see it in the others' faces. Something wasn't right. We tried to distract ourselves, to talk louder, but the fire didn't feel warm anymore. It felt like something cold and unseen was pressing against us, waiting. Around midnight, Dan stood up abruptly, his eyes wide, staring into the darkness beyond the firelight. "I saw something," he muttered. "Something watching us." "Quit messing around," I said, though I could feel the tightness in my throat. But Dan wasn't laughing. He pointed toward the trees, his hand shaking. There was something, standing between the trees, looking at us. We all stared into the darkness, straining our eyes. The firelight barely reached the edge of the trees, leaving the forest in pitch blackness. My heart was pounding. Every shadow seemed to twist and writhe, but I didn't see anything. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement. Something tall, unnaturally tall, slipped between the trees. It was fast, too fast to be human. I barely caught a glimpse. Long limbs, pale skin, moving on all fours like a distorted version of a person. "We need to go," Sarah, my other friend, whispered, her voice shaking. "We need to leave now." But leaving wasn't an option. The forest was too dark, and we had no idea what was out there. So we stayed by the fire, huddled close, trying to convince ourselves that it was just a deer or some wild animal. But deep down, we knew. This was no animal. As the hours dragged on, the whispers grew louder, closer. They circled us, sometimes sounding like laughter, other times like someone calling our names. But we never saw who or what was making the sounds. Every now and then we'd catch glimpses of it, something slinking between the trees, just out of reach, always watching. It seemed to enjoy toying with us, staying hidden just long enough to keep us terrified. The worst part was when the footprints started. At first we didn't notice, but as dawn began to creep closer, Sarah gasped. There, in the dirt around our camp, were footprints. Large, clawed, but not quite animal. And the worst part? There were too many of them, coming from every direction, circling, closing in on us. The panic set in. "We have to go," Dan yelled. "I don't care if it's dark. We have to leave." We gathered our things in a rush, leaving half of it behind, and bolted for the path we came in on. But the path was different. It was like the forest had shifted, the trees standing closer, the underbrush thicker. And then came the sound. A howl, low, guttural, and unlike anything I'd ever heard. It made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It echoed through the forest, followed by the sound of something crashing through the trees. Something big. We ran, but no matter how fast we moved, it felt like we were being herded, pushed deeper into the forest. The thing, whatever it was, kept pace with us, its heavy footsteps just behind the trees. Occasionally I'd see those glowing red eyes in the distance, staring at us with a malevolent intelligence, watching us panic. And then Sarah screamed. I turned just in time to see her vanish. One moment she was there, running beside me. The next, she was gone, pulled into the darkness. I heard her scream echo through the trees, but it was cut short, as if something had muffled her, smothered her sound. Dan and I ran faster, but the forest seemed endless. The trail was gone, the landmarks unfamiliar. The whispers grew louder, closer, and I could swear I heard Sarah's voice among them, calling my name, but twisted, wrong. It wasn't her. By some miracle, we stumbled back into the clearing where the car was parked. Dan scrambled for the keys, hands shaking while I kept my eyes on the tree line. I could feel it, whatever was hunting us, just beyond the shadows, watching, waiting. Finally, the engine roared to life and we sped down the dirt road, the forest disappearing behind us. The feeling of relief was short-lived, though. I could still hear the whispers, faint but persistent. Even over the roar of the engine, they were following us, carrying on the wind. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town, and even then we didn't speak. What could we say? Sarah was gone, lost to whatever was out there. We couldn't explain it, and no one would believe us if we tried. That was 3 days ago. Dan hasn't spoken since, barely eats, barely sleeps. I can't stop hearing those whispers. No matter where I go, no matter how loud I play the TV or the radio, they're always there, just on the edge of my hearing. And sometimes at night I catch a glimpse of something tall, something wrong, standing just outside my window. I've always loved camping. The quiet isolation of the deep woods, miles from anyone, nothing but the sound of wind through the trees and the crackle of a campfire. It's a kind of peace you can't find anywhere else. Or so I thought. This trip was supposed to be like all the others. A few days in the wilderness, far from the noise of the world. I had chosen a spot deep in the forest, a place I'd heard about from a friend. Said it was perfect for solitude, off the beaten path, not even marked on most maps. The kind of place where no one would bother you. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun already dipping behind the towering pines. The air smelled earthy, rich with pine needles and damp moss. The trail was nearly invisible, overgrown and winding, as if the forest itself wanted to swallow it whole. That should have been my first warning, but I ignored it. I just wanted to set up camp before nightfall. By the time my tent was pitched, darkness had settled in. The fire cast long shadows that flickered like spirits dancing between the trees. I sat there staring into the flames, letting the quiet wash over me. It was peaceful at first, but the silence, it felt wrong. Too thick, like the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something. That's when I heard it, a rustling in the bushes maybe 20 feet away. I froze, straining to listen. Could have been a deer or maybe a raccoon. But then the rustling stopped, and I swear I heard something else. A low, raspy breath, almost human, but not quite. My stomach knotted up. "Hello?" I called out, immediately regretting it. My voice sounded small, fragile, like it was being swallowed by the forest. No answer. The fire crackled loudly, the only sound breaking the stillness. I shook it off, told myself it was just the wind or some animal, and forced myself to go to bed. But sleep didn't come easy. Every creak, every snap of a twig outside the tent set my nerves on edge. I lay there, eyes wide open, waiting, listening. Sometime after midnight I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate. Someone, or something, was circling my tent. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay there, frozen, too terrified to breathe. The footsteps stopped right outside the tent flap. I stared at the zipper, expecting it to move. I don't know how long I lay there, waiting for whatever was out there to come inside. But eventually, the footsteps retreated, fading back into the woods. I didn't sleep after that. At dawn, I packed up my gear, ready to get the hell out of there. I figured it was just some animal, maybe even another camper messing with me, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. As I was throwing my pack over my shoulder, a voice behind me made me jump out of my skin. "You all right, son?" I whipped around to see a park ranger standing there, his uniform old and worn, his face hidden beneath the brim of a wide ranger hat. "Jesus, you scared me," I said, trying to laugh it off. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just heading out." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Strange place to camp. Not many people come out this far. "I like the isolation," I replied, though my voice was shaky. "But I think I've had enough of it." The ranger tilted his head slightly, his smile fading. "Smart choice. These woods, they're different. Sometimes people come out here and they don't come back the same, if they come back at all." I tried to laugh it off, but his words hung heavy in the air. He didn't say anything else, just turned and walked back into the trees. I stood there for a minute, shaken, but I couldn't just stand there all day. I started hiking back down the trail, eager to put as much distance between me and the campsite as possible. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The woods felt wrong. The trees were too close, the shadows too deep. Every sound seemed amplified, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, and then I heard it again. Footsteps. At first they were distant, but they grew louder, faster, matching my pace. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see the ranger, but no one was there. The forest around me seemed to blur, twisting into shapes that didn't make sense. Panic surged through me, and I started running. The footsteps followed, pounding the earth behind me, impossibly fast. I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest. The trail twisted, the trees a blur of dark green and brown, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was following me was getting closer. And then, out of nowhere, I burst into a small clearing, an old ranger station, long abandoned. The door hung loosely on its hinges and the windows were cracked, covered in grime. I didn't think. I ran inside, slamming the door behind me. For a moment there was silence, nothing but the sound of my own ragged breathing. Then I heard it, a voice, soft and familiar. "Hello?" It was my voice, coming from outside. I froze, blood running cold. "Hello?" The voice called again, this time closer. "Are you all right?" I backed away from the door, heart pounding in my chest. The voice, my voice, was right outside. "Come on out, it's safe," it said, a twisted mockery of my tone. And then, almost like a whisper, "You can't hide from me." The door creaked, slowly. I backed into a corner, my eyes locked on the door as it swung open, and there, standing in the doorway, was me, or something wearing my face. It smiled, my smile, but its eyes, they were wrong. Too black, too empty, like twin voids staring back at me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The thing wearing my face stepped closer, that smile never faltering. "You shouldn't have come here," it whispered, its voice distorting, breaking apart like static. "This place, it belongs to us now." I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed by fear, but when I finally blinked, it was gone. The door was open, the woods silent once again. I ran. I ran harder than I've ever run in my life, not stopping until I reached the road where I'd parked my car. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. That was 2 days ago. I'm safe now, I think. But last night, as I lay in my bed, I heard something outside my window. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. And then, a voice. My voice. "Are you all right?" I wasn't supposed to be there. I knew that from the moment I stepped off the trail, the warnings buzzing in the back of my head like an irritating gnat. The signs had been clear. Stay on marked paths. Report all strange sightings. But something about the solitude of the woods had pulled me in deeper until I was miles away from the main campsite. That's what I wanted after all. Peace, no people, just me and the forest. The sun was sinking fast behind the trees, casting long shadows across the underbrush. The air had that sticky, cool bite that comes just before dusk, and I knew I had to set up camp soon. It wasn't my first time camping alone, but the isolation felt different this time. The woods were thicker here, the sounds more muted, as if the trees themselves were listening. I found a small clearing perfect for my tent and a little fire. I was halfway through setting up when I heard it, the unmistakable crunch of footsteps. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. They were distant but deliberate, and they didn't belong to any animal. They were too heavy for that. "Hello?" I called, but my voice felt weak against the growing night. There was no response, just the sound of those footsteps getting closer, then stopping suddenly. The forest went eerily quiet again. I shook it off. Probably just another camper off the trail, I thought, though I hadn't seen anyone all day. There was something comforting about that idea. Another human being out here. That thought, however, quickly dissolved when I saw something out of the corner of my eye. At first I couldn't quite place what I was seeing, just a flash of movement, too fast and too far to make out. But there was something wrong about it. The way it moved, low to the ground, almost crawling, but with a fluidity that made my skin crawl. I turned fully toward the spot where I'd seen it, flashlight ready, but there was nothing there, just trees and the encroaching darkness. I swallowed hard and got back to setting up camp, trying to push the growing unease from my mind. By the time the fire was crackling, the woods had become a shadowy maze. The sounds had returned, night birds calling out, the rustling of leaves, the distant hum of the wind. But something still felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. An hour passed, maybe more. I was lost in thought, staring into the flames, when the snap of a branch made me jerk upright. This time the sound was closer, much closer. I shot up, grabbed my flashlight, and swung the beam in a wide arc around the campsite. The light cut through the dark but revealed only trees and undergrowth. My heart pounded in my ears. "Who's out there?" I shouted, hoping my voice didn't betray my fear. The silence that followed was absolute, crushing. Then a voice answered, a low, raspy whisper that made my blood turn cold. "Help me." I blinked, unsure if I'd actually heard it. The voice was so faint, so wrong. It was human, but warped, like someone who hadn't spoken in years was trying to remember how. "Who's there?" I asked, my voice trembling now. The response was immediate, closer than before. "Please, help me." I swept the flashlight around frantically, trying to pinpoint the source. My heart leaped into my throat when the light caught something, eyes glowing faintly in the dark, low to the ground. They blinked, and then they were gone, vanishing into the blackness. I backed up toward the fire, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My mind raced, searching for an explanation. A trick of the light? An animal? But the voice, it had been human. I was sure of it. Another snap, this time directly behind me. I spun around, light shaking in my hand, and froze. There, standing at the edge of the clearing, was a man. Or at least, it looked like a man. His face was gaunt, the skin stretched too tightly over his bones, his eyes sunken and hollow. His clothes were torn, ragged, hanging from his thin frame like they didn't belong to him. "Help me," he rasped again, but his lips didn't move. The voice was coming from him, but it was all wrong, like a ventriloquist's puppet. He took a step forward, his limbs jerky, unnatural. I stumbled back, the flashlight shaking wildly in my hand. I can get help," I stammered. I'll call someone. Just stay there." But he didn't stop. Another step and then another, his movements becoming faster, more erratic. As he approached, I realized with dawning horror that his skin, it wasn't right. It was shifting, sliding over his muscles like a loose sheet, like it didn't quite fit. I turned and bolted, crashing through the underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes and face. My only thought was to run, to get away from whatever that thing was. The footsteps behind me were fast, impossibly fast, keeping pace with me no matter how hard I pushed myself. That awful voice echoed through the trees, distorted and wrong. "Help me! Don't leave me!" I didn't stop, couldn't stop. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but I ran until I burst out onto the main trail, the dirt path suddenly familiar and grounding. I skidded to a halt, gasping for air, and turned to look behind me. Nothing. The woods were empty, quiet. I didn't stick around to question it. I sprinted back toward the ranger station, desperate for the safety of lights, of people. When I burst through the door, breathless and wild-eyed, the ranger on duty looked up from his desk, startled. "You all right, buddy?" he asked, his brow furrowed. I tried to explain, the words tumbling out of me in a frantic mess. "There's something out there, a man but not a man. He was chasing me. His skin, it wasn't right." The ranger's face darkened, and he stood slowly, grabbing a flashlight from his desk. "You weren't off the trail, were you?" he asked, his tone low. I nodded, my pulse still pounding in my ears. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his stubbled jaw. "You're lucky you made it back. Most don't." What was that thing?" I asked, still shaking. The ranger glanced toward the window as if expecting to see something lurking in the dark. Then he turned back to me, his eyes cold, almost sad. "You've heard of skinwalkers, right?" I shook my head, but I'd heard the stories, the legends. Just campfire tales, I'd thought. "They're real," he said flatly, "and they don't like people wandering into their territory." I felt the blood drain from my face. "But you're here. It can't follow me, right?" The ranger gave me a long, hard look, and then, Without a word, he slowly began to peel off his skin. His eyes gleamed, black as pitch. "Who says I didn't?" The forest had always been my escape, a place where I could lose myself in the quiet, away from the noise and stress of everyday life. So when my best friend Matt suggested a weekend camping trip in Black Pine Forest, I didn't hesitate. It was remote, sure, but that was the appeal. No cell signal, no distractions, just us, the trees, and the stars. It was 4 of us, me, Matt, his girlfriend Jess, and her brother Luke. We'd been on trips together before, but this one felt different. The moment we passed the faded sign marking the edge of Black Pine Forest, the air seemed heavier, thicker. The trees stood taller here, their branches twisting in strange, unnatural ways that seemed to blot out the sky. We joked about how eerie it felt, laughing nervously as we hiked deeper into the woods, but there was an unspoken tension in the group. The deeper we went, the quieter the forest became. No birds, no wind, just the sound of our footsteps crunching through the underbrush. By the time we found a clearing to set up camp, the sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor. We built a fire, but it didn't seem to chase away the cold like it usually did. Something about the night felt off. As we sat around the fire, roasting marshmallows, we heard it, a distant sound, like a branch snapping. We all paused, glancing at each other. Luke, the skeptic of the group, brushed it off as an animal, probably a deer, but it didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. It was too deliberate, too close. "Maybe we should have picked a different spot," Jess muttered, half joking. "This place gives me the creeps." Matt laughed, trying to lighten the mood. "Come on, it's just a forest. What's the worst that could happen?" As if in response, there was another snap, closer this time. Luke stood up, shining his flashlight into the trees. "See? Nothing but a bunch of—" He stopped mid-sentence, his light frozen on something in the distance. His face went pale. "What the hell is that?" We all turned, following the beam of his flashlight. At first I didn't see anything, just more trees. But then I noticed it, a figure standing between the trunks. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and its skin was pale, almost translucent. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there watching us. Matt was the first to speak, his voice low. "Is that a person?" None of us responded. We were too stunned, too terrified. The figure shifted slightly, its head tilting in a slow, unnatural way, like it was trying to decide what we were. "Guys," Jess whispered, "we need to get out of here." Before any of us could move, the figure stepped forward, revealing long, twisted limbs that bent in ways they shouldn't. It was humanoid, but not quite. Something about it was all wrong, like it had been stitched together from nightmares. We bolted. Grabbing what we could, we ran deeper into the forest, the figure's presence pressing against our backs like a physical weight. The trees seemed to close in on us, their branches clawing at our clothes and skin as we stumbled through the underbrush. We didn't stop until we couldn't run any farther, collapsing in another small clearing, gasping for breath. But the figure was gone. Or at least, it seemed to be. "What the hell was that thing?" Matt panted, his face slick with sweat. "I don't know," Luke muttered, shaking his head. "But we're not sticking around to find out." We tried to retrace our steps to get back to the car, but the forest didn't seem to want us to leave. The paths we thought we had come down were gone, swallowed by the undergrowth. Every tree looked the same, and no matter which direction we went, we always ended up back in the same clearing. That's when we saw the tracks, huge clawed footprints like something straight out of a nightmare, pressed deep into the soil around the clearing. They weren't there before, I was sure of it. And they weren't human. "Okay," Jess said, her voice trembling. "This is officially messed up." We agreed to stay together, huddling around a small fire we built with the little dry wood we could find. Night fell quickly, and with it the sense that something was watching us from just beyond the light of the fire. Then came the noises. At first it was subtle, branches creaking, leaves rustling, but soon it escalated. Low growls, like something huge prowling in the shadows, circling us. We couldn't see it, but we knew it was there. And then, just when we thought it couldn't get worse, the ranger appeared. He walked into our camp as if nothing was wrong, his flashlight cutting through the dark. His uniform was crisp, his face calm. Too calm. "Everything all right here, folks?" His voice was low, soothing, but there was something off about him, something that made my skin crawl. "We need to get out of here," Luke said, his voice shaking. "There's something in the woods." The ranger smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, I wouldn't worry about that. These woods, they can play tricks on you." He crouched down by the fire, poking at it with a stick. "You'll be safe as long as you stay by the fire." I didn't trust him. There was something wrong about the way he moved, the way he spoke. I noticed his hands, too large with long fingers that ended in sharp black nails. "You're not a ranger, are you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked at me then, his smile widening, revealing sharp, glistening teeth. "Smart one, aren't you?" Before any of us could react, he stood up, his body shifting, contorting, bones cracking as his limbs stretched and bent. His skin seemed to melt away, revealing something monstrous beneath. Tall, thin, with a head too large for its body and glowing yellow eyes that stared hungrily at us. We ran again, but this time there was no escape. The trees seemed to close in, the shadows deepening. I could hear the creature behind us, its guttural growl vibrating through the air. We split up, desperate, stumbling through the dark, but I didn't get far before I heard Matt scream. It was cut off abruptly, followed by a sickening crunch. I stopped, my heart pounding in my chest, and looked around, but there was no sign of the others, no sign of anything, just the oppressive darkness of the forest. That's when I heard the voice. "You're almost there." It was Jess, or at least it sounded like her. But when I turned, it wasn't her standing there. It was the ranger, grinning, and behind him I saw them, my friends, or what was left of them, twisted, deformed, their faces contorted in expressions of terror. They weren't dead, but they weren't alive either. The ranger, no, the creature, stepped closer, its grin widening. "Welcome to the forest," it whispered, as everything went dark. And that's when I realized I had never left. This forest, these creatures, they had been waiting for us all along. And now we were part of it. Forever. I've always been the kind of guy who likes a challenge, which is probably why I agreed to this insane camping trip in the first place. Miles off the grid, no trail markers, no campsites, nothing but the wild and us. It was supposed to be an adventure. The kind of weekend where you come back with stories that make everyone at the office jealous. There were 4 of us, me, Jake, our mutual friend Nate, and this guy I didn't know too well, David. He was a last-minute addition, brought in by Nate. David was one of those quiet, intense types. Didn't say much, but had this way of watching everyone like he was sizing us up. I didn't think too much of it at the time. I probably should have. The drive was long, and the trailhead we finally stopped at wasn't even on a map. Jake had heard about it from some guy at work who swore it was a hidden gem, a place no one ever went, untouched by the crowds that overran most camping spots. Looking back, I wonder why it was so hidden in the first place. We hiked deep into the forest, the trees growing thicker, their canopy so dense that barely any sunlight filtered through. The deeper we went, the quieter everything became. It was that kind of unnatural quiet where even the birds stopped singing. The only sound was the crunch of our boots and the rustling of our gear. By late afternoon, we reached a clearing, and I was relieved to see we could at least set up camp without getting lost in the maze of trees. But something about that clearing felt off. It was circular, too perfect, like the forest had peeled itself back from that one spot for a reason. I brushed the thought aside. Maybe I was just tired. We got the tents up, started a fire, and everything seemed normal enough. We joked around, had a few beers, and settled in as night fell. But there was something odd about David. He barely spoke the whole time, just sat staring into the fire with this unsettling intensity. His face flickered in the firelight, his expression unreadable. Around midnight, Jake stood up, stretching. "I'm going to grab more wood," he said, slapping Nate on the shoulder. "Want to help?" Nate groaned but followed him, and the two of them disappeared into the trees, their headlamps bobbing like distant stars. I stayed by the fire with David. The quiet between us grew thick, uncomfortable. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the distant wind whispering through the trees. That's when I noticed something strange. David wasn't watching the fire anymore. He was staring out into the dark woods, unblinking, like he was waiting for something. His face was tense, jaw clenched tight, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. "You okay, man?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but my voice wavered. He didn't answer, just kept staring, eyes locked on the shadows between the trees. The rustling of leaves snapped my attention toward the direction Jake and Nate had gone. I assumed it was them coming back, but the sound was wrong. It was too fast, too erratic, like something crashing through the underbrush. I stood up, straining my ears, but I couldn't see anything beyond the circle of light cast by the fire. "Jake?" I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness. No answer. That's when I saw it. A figure, moving between the trees, just at the edge of the clearing. It was barely visible, almost like a shadow against the night. But there was something off about its movement. It didn't walk. It glided, smooth and unnatural, like it wasn't part of the world. "Jake, is that you?" I yelled, but the figure didn't respond. It just stopped, standing there at the very edge of the light, just far enough that I couldn't make out its face. I turned to David, but he was still staring into the darkness, his body rigid. I grabbed my flashlight and swung it toward the figure, but it was gone. Just trees and empty space. My heart was pounding now. "Where the hell is Jake?" I muttered, more to myself than anyone. David finally spoke, his voice low and unnerving. "They won't come back." "What?" "They won't come back," he repeated, his eyes still fixed on the woods. "They never do." I stared at him, my stomach twisting with unease. "What the hell are you talking about?" David finally turned to me, and in the glow of the fire, I saw something in his face that sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't fear. It was acceptance. "You shouldn't have come here," he said quietly. I laughed, but it was hollow. "Come on, man. Quit messing around." He shook his head. "It's not a joke. This place, it's not like anywhere else. I've been here before." That stopped me cold. "What do you mean? You've been here?" David nodded, his eyes dark and distant. "Years ago, I lost 2 friends here. Same way. They went into the woods, and they never came back." I felt a knot of panic tighten in my chest. "You've got to be kidding me." "I tried to warn Nate," he continued, ignoring me. "Told him we shouldn't come here, but he wouldn't listen." The rustling sound returned, louder now, closer. I swung my flashlight around, desperately scanning the trees. But there was nothing, just the empty forest. My pulse was racing. Something wasn't right. My gut screamed at me to run, but I couldn't leave without Jake and Nate. Suddenly, David stood up. "It's starting," he muttered, more to himself than to me. I grabbed his arm. "What's starting?" He yanked his arm free and stepped toward the edge of the clearing, his eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. "They always come back, at first, but they're not the same." Before I could ask what the hell he meant, a sound came from the woods. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching through the fallen leaves. Relief surged through me. Jake and Nate were back. "Guys?" I called out, but my voice was shaky. Then I saw them. Jake and Nate stepped into the clearing, but something was wrong. Their movements were stiff, unnatural, like their bodies were being pulled forward by invisible strings. Their faces were pale, eyes wide and vacant. Dead eyes. "Jake? Nate?" I whispered, but they didn't respond. David didn't move, just stood there watching as they walked. No, glided closer. My blood turned to ice. This wasn't right. Something was horribly, terribly wrong. "They're not real anymore," David said softly. "They look like them, but they're not. Not anymore." I took a step back, my mind reeling, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Jake and Nate, whatever they were, stopped just a few feet from the fire, their faces blank, empty. David turned to me, his expression grim. "This place, it takes them, leaves copies, but they're hollow. They'll try to lure us into the woods next." I backed away, fear clawing at my throat. "We have to get out of here." David nodded, but there was no hope in his eyes. "It's too late." As he spoke, the figures that used to be Jake and Nate took a step closer. Their eyes locked on me now, their mouths slowly curling into unnatural, empty smiles. And then they spoke. "Come with us." Their voices were wrong, distorted, too high, like they were mimicking the real Jake and Nate, but didn't know how to get the tone right. My skin crawled. "We have to run," I whispered, but David didn't move. He just smiled, a sad, resigned smile. "You can't run from the forest." I turned and bolted, not caring if David followed. As I crashed through the trees, that same eerie voice echoed behind me, chasing me deeper into the night. "Come with us. I'm still running. I don't know if I'll ever stop." We didn't plan to camp that weekend, at least not at that spot. It was supposed to be just a day hike, a chance for me, Ben, and Lily to get away from the chaos of work and school for a while. But when we found that clearing, that perfect secluded spot near the river, Ben insisted we stay the night. It was too perfect to pass up. In hindsight, I wish we'd just kept hiking. The spot was almost surreal. The river wound through the trees like a silver ribbon, and the dense forest felt like a barrier from the rest of the world. No roads, no people, just us and the wilderness. We set up camp on a patch of soft grass, the canopy above filtering the late afternoon sunlight into a golden haze. It was peaceful, beautiful even. We built a fire as the sun dipped below the horizon, and after a while, the usual camping routine kicked in, roasting marshmallows, telling old stories, laughing. It felt good to be out there, disconnected from everything. But the moment the sun fully disappeared, that feeling shifted. Something about the forest felt wrong. I can't say what triggered it exactly. Maybe it was how suddenly the night closed in around us, the way the trees seemed to press in tighter, as if the darkness itself was alive. Or maybe it was the silence. The sudden, absolute silence. No wind, no crickets, no rustling of leaves, just an eerie stillness. At first we didn't notice it. It was Lily who spoke up, her voice quiet, almost afraid to break the hush. "Do you guys hear that?" We stopped talking and listened. Nothing. The kind of silence that felt unnatural, like the world had been muted. I laughed it off, tried to shake the creeping unease. "It's just the forest. Sometimes it goes quiet," I said, trying to convince myself as much as her. But the look in Ben's eyes told me he wasn't buying it either. He looked over his shoulder, scanning the tree line. I followed his gaze, and that's when I saw something move. It was quick, just a flicker of motion at the edge of the firelight, deep in the trees. A figure, I thought. But it was gone as fast as I'd noticed it. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice lower now, tension creeping into my words. Ben nodded, his face pale in the glow of the fire. "Yeah, thought I was imagining it." Lily stood up, looking between the two of us. "What are you talking about?" "Someone's out there," I whispered, not wanting to say it too loud, like admitting it would make it real. For a moment, none of us moved. We just stood there, staring into the darkness beyond the firelight, searching for any sign of movement. The trees loomed like dark sentinels, their trunks blending into the shadows, impossible to make out where they ended and the night began. Then the footsteps started, faint at first, like someone treading lightly through the underbrush. They came from deep within the woods, just far enough that we couldn't see the source, but close enough that we all heard it. Lily's eyes widened. "Maybe it's a deer," she suggested, her voice trembling, though she didn't sound convinced. "But deer don't move like that. They don't stop and start the way this thing was doing, circling around us, staying just out of sight." My heart was pounding in my chest, my mouth dry. Something was out there, watching us, and it wasn't a deer. Ben grabbed his flashlight and flicked it on, sweeping the beam across the trees. The light cut through the darkness, but all it revealed were the trunks of trees and the occasional flicker of branches. No figures, no movement. But the sound, the footsteps, continued, slowly circling the camp, like someone, or something, was playing with us. "Who's out there?" Ben shouted, the beam of his flashlight jerking as his hand shook. No response, just the steady crunch of footsteps moving around us. My stomach twisted with a deep, primal fear. This wasn't normal. This wasn't right. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. The silence returned, even heavier now, almost suffocating. Ben lowered his flashlight, his face pale. Lily was gripping my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. "I don't like this," she whispered, barely audible over the crackling of the fire. "We should go." But go where? We were miles from the nearest road, deep in the forest with only the river as our guide. And in the dark, with whatever was out there, moving felt just as dangerous as staying put. Ben was about to say something when we heard it, a soft, low voice coming from the trees. "Help me." It was faint, almost a whisper, but we all heard it. My blood ran cold. It didn't sound right. The words were clear, but there was something off about the way they were spoken, like whoever, or whatever, was saying them wasn't used to speaking. "Help me." It came again, this time closer, from the same direction as the footsteps. But still, we couldn't see anything. Ben pointed the flashlight toward the voice, his hand shaking. "Who's out there?" he called again, though his voice had lost its bravado. For a long moment, there was nothing. No footsteps, no voice, just the oppressive silence pressing in around us. Then, from the edge of the trees, something stepped into the light. At first it looked like a person, a man maybe, tall, with long, thin limbs and skin so pale it almost seemed to glow in the dark. But as the flashlight beam hit it, I realized with a growing sense of horror that this thing, whatever it was wrong. Its face was stretched too long, its eyes wide and dark like hollow pits. Its mouth was open, lips too thin, and it smiled, revealing rows of too sharp teeth. It wasn't a person. "Help me," it whispered again, though its mouth barely moved. The voice came from it, but it sounded wrong. Lily gasped, backing up so quickly she almost fell over the fire pit. Ben dropped the flashlight, the beam spinning wildly as it hit the ground. We were plunged into darkness. Without thinking, I grabbed Lily's arm and ran. Ben followed, his footsteps heavy behind us. I didn't care where we were going, just away from the campsite, away from that thing. The footsteps followed us. Not just ours, but those same slow, deliberate steps, keeping pace with us in the trees. We ran, stumbling through the underbrush, the river our only guide. My heart pounded in my chest, my lungs burning, but I didn't dare stop. Every time I glanced back, I could see it, moving between the trees, its pale form flickering in and out of sight, always just behind us. "Help Me, the voice whispered again, so close it felt like it was right behind my ear. I didn't look back. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. By the time we piled in, all of us were gasping for breath, our faces pale with terror. Ben slammed the car into gear, and we sped down the dirt road, the forest blurring by in the rearview mirror. We never spoke about it after that night. I don't think any of us could. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone and it's quiet, I still hear that voice. Help me. And I know, whatever it was that we saw in those woods, it's still out there, watching, waiting. There's something about camping in the deep woods that always gave me a thrill, a mixture of fear and excitement. But after what happened on that trip last year, I'll never step foot into the wilderness again. It was supposed to be a weekend of adventure, just me, my girlfriend Anna, and our friend Greg. We were headed to a remote area we'd never been to before, about 5 hours from town, in a state park that Greg had read about online. He claimed it was perfect for an off-the-grid experience. No people, no distractions, just us and nature. The drive out was beautiful, golden fields, winding mountain roads, and eventually the forest swallowed us whole. The deeper we went, the fewer signs of civilization we saw. By the time we reached the trailhead, it felt like we were 1,000,000 miles away from anywhere. The campsite Greg picked was deep in the forest, a 3-hour hike from the trailhead. As we made our way through the trees, the air grew cooler and the canopy above grew thicker, blocking out most of the sunlight. It was peaceful but also unnervingly quiet. No birds, no wind, just our footsteps crunching through the underbrush. By the time we found the clearing, the sun had started to dip below the horizon. We set up our tents and got a fire going, just in time for the first hints of night to settle in. The spot was strange, though. Even though it was deep in the woods, the clearing seemed too perfect. The trees formed a near circle around it, and there were no signs of wildlife, no deer tracks, no birds, not even a squirrel. Just silence. As the fire crackled, we tried to shake off the weird vibes, telling ourselves it was just the isolation playing tricks on us. We joked, ate, and shared stories, but as the night deepened, that creeping feeling of unease returned. I could feel it in my gut, like something was watching us from the trees, just beyond the reach of the firelight. Around midnight, Greg decided to go for a walk to gather more firewood. "Be back in 10, he said, grabbing his flashlight and heading toward the trees. Anna and I sat by the fire, listening to the faint crack of branches as he disappeared into the darkness. 10 minutes passed, then 20, then 30. "Where the hell is he?" Anna asked, her voice tense. "I don't know, maybe he got lost. I'll go find him," I said, grabbing my flashlight. The moment I stepped into the woods, the quiet was overwhelming. It was like the forest was holding its breath. I called out Greg's name, but there was no response. My light barely penetrated the darkness. The trees seemed to loom closer, their gnarled branches twisting like skeletal arms. I walked for what felt like ages, but I didn't find any trace of Greg. No footprints, no broken branches. Nothing. The strangest part? I couldn't hear him either. No crunching leaves, no distant voice. It was like he had simply vanished. My chest tightened with panic, and I rushed back to the campsite expecting to find Anna waiting. But when I emerged from the trees, she was gone too. The fire was still crackling, her flashlight resting beside her empty chair. My heart hammered in my chest. I called out her name, shouting louder and louder, but the only answer I got was the echo of my own voice bouncing back through the trees. I grabbed both flashlights and started searching the perimeter of the clearing. The forest felt wrong. The way the trees seemed to twist unnaturally in the darkness, the overwhelming stillness, the smell of damp earth and something rotten, like decaying leaves. That's when I saw it. At the edge of the clearing where Greg had disappeared earlier, there was a faint glow, just barely visible through the dense trees. It wasn't firelight. It was whiter, softer, almost like a mist. My pulse raced as I approached, flashlight trembling in my hand. The closer I got, the more I realized the glow wasn't coming from a light source. It was coming from something else. The trees began to thin out as I reached the source. My breath hitched in my throat when I saw it. A clearing, another one. Only this one was different. It was smaller, maybe only 20 feet wide, and at the center stood what I could only describe as the remnants of an old campsite. Rotten, collapsed tents, the skeleton of a fire pit, rusted camping gear scattered on the ground, overgrown with moss and vines. And then I saw them, 3 tents much like ours but disintegrating. Something about them seemed eerily familiar. My mind raced. Could this be some kind of forgotten campsite? But it looked ancient, like it had been abandoned for decades. I shone my light over the collapsed tents, and that's when I saw something that made my blood run cold. Scattered across the ground, just visible under the layers of leaves and dirt, were old faded photographs. I bent down, picking one up with trembling fingers. It was a picture of 3 people standing in front of a campfire, smiling. My heart stopped. It was us. Me, Anna, and Greg. My hands shook as I flipped through more of the pictures. They were all of us, arriving at the campsite, setting up our tents, sitting around the fire. But they looked old. The edges of the photos were worn, yellowed with time. And then I noticed the last photo. It was of the clearing I stood in now, but there was something horribly wrong. The 3 of us, Anna, Greg, and I, were lying on the ground in unnatural positions, limbs twisted, faces contorted in silent screams. I dropped the pictures, stumbling back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. This couldn't be real. How were these pictures here? And why did they show us dead? Suddenly I heard a voice behind me. Looking for something? I spun around, my flashlight flickering wildly. Standing at the edge of the clearing was Greg, but something was off. His face was blank, his eyes empty, like he wasn't fully there. "Greg, where's Anna?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer, the empty expression on his face never changing. Behind him, the trees seemed to shift, shadows moving unnaturally between the branches. I backed away, the flashlight shaking in my hand. "Greg, what's going on? Where's Anna?" But Greg wasn't Greg anymore. He tilted his head slightly, a twisted smile spreading across his face as he stepped into the clearing, his movements slow, deliberate, as if he was being controlled by something else. I ran. I didn't think. I didn't look back. I just sprinted through the trees, the sound of footsteps echoing behind me, growing faster, closer. The forest felt like a labyrinth, the trees closing in, branches clawing at my clothes and skin. I don't know how long I ran before I stumbled onto the trail again, panting and soaked in sweat. I never looked back. I don't even know if Greg, or whatever was chasing me, was still following. I eventually made it back to the car, but I was alone. I called the rangers, told them everything, but they found nothing. No sign of Anna, no sign of Greg. Just an empty campsite and a fire that had long since burned out. That forgotten clearing, it doesn't show up on any maps, but I'll never forget what I saw there, or the photos of us lying dead on the ground. Whoever or whatever took those pictures is still out there, in those woods, waiting for the next group of campers to stumble upon their twisted game. And I'll never go back to find out what happens next. I never believed in ghost stories, not really. They were the kind of things you laugh about around a campfire, but never take seriously. Until that night. Until the night something happened that I can't explain. It started as a regular camping trip, just me and my best friend, Derek. We'd been planning it for weeks, a long weekend in the woods, away from everything, just 2 guys with a couple of tents and enough beer to last until Monday. The campsite we picked was pretty far out, down a dirt road that looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. No other campers, no cabins, no signs of civilization for miles. Perfect, we thought. The day went by uneventfully. We set up our tents, gathered some wood, and by the time the sun started setting, We had a fire going. The air was cool. The woods were quiet. Almost too quiet. But I figured that was just the remoteness of the place. I mean, we wanted to be alone, right? As the sky darkened, we sat around the fire, drinking and swapping stories. Most of them were the usual stuff. Dumb things we did in high school, work stress, bad relationships. The fire crackled, the trees swayed in the breeze, and I felt good, relaxed, until Derek brought up the subject of local legends. "You ever heard of the Watcher of the Pines?" he asked, half smiling, as if daring me to call him out on a stupid prank. I shook my head. "What's that, another Bigfoot story?" "No, man, way creepier." He took a sip of his beer, his eyes flicking toward the darkness just beyond the firelight. "It's like, I don't know, like a local thing. People say there's something in these woods, something that watches you, but you can't see it. Not until it's too late." I laughed, but there was something in Derek's voice that made me uneasy. "Come on, man, you're not seriously buying into that crap, are you?" I didn't, not until my cousin went missing out here a few years back. He tossed his empty can into the fire, the flames flaring up for a moment. He was camping just like us. Said he kept hearing things at night, like someone walking around his tent, but every time he checked, there was no one there. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I shrugged it off. "So, what happened?" Derek stared into the fire for a moment, his expression darkening. "They never found him. Just his tent. It was ripped open, like something had dragged him out." For a while we sat there in silence, the fire crackling and popping between us. I didn't want to admit it, but the story got under my skin. There was something about the way Derek told it, the way the forest seemed to listen, that made the air feel colder. Eventually we called it a night. Derek was asleep within minutes of hitting his sleeping bag, but I lay awake, staring up at the nylon ceiling of my tent, listening to the sounds outside, or rather the lack of sounds. There were no crickets, no rustling leaves, no distant animal calls, just dead silence. The kind of silence that presses in on you, makes you hyper-aware of every tiny noise. I closed my eyes, trying to calm myself, telling myself it was all in my head. But then I heard it. Footsteps. Soft, shuffling footsteps coming from the edge of the campsite. My eyes snapped open and my heart began to race. The sound was faint, but unmistakable. Someone, or something, was moving around out there. I sat up slowly, careful not to make any noise, and reached for the flashlight by my side. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, listening, waiting. Then they started again, closer this time. I clicked on the flashlight and pointed it toward Derek's tent. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the thin fabric of his tent, lit up like a ghostly white dome. No movement, no shadow. I swept the light around the campsite, my hand trembling. The fire had burned down to embers, casting weak, flickering light. The trees stood like dark sentinels, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. Everything looked normal. Too normal. I was about to call out to Derek when the footsteps stopped again, right on the edge of the light. My heart pounded in my chest, the air thick with tension. I could feel eyes on me, like something was standing just beyond my reach, watching, waiting. Suddenly there was a rustling sound, quick and sharp, like something moving fast through the brush. My flashlight beam jerked in the direction of the noise, but there was nothing there. Just the empty woods, stretching into darkness. Then I heard the zipper of Derek's tent. "Derek?" I whispered, my voice shaky. No response. The zipper sound came again, this time slower, like it was being pulled open from the inside. I stood up, my legs unsteady, and took a step toward his tent. "Derek, are you messing with me, man? This isn't funny." Still nothing. The zipper finished its slow slide down and the flap of his tent hung open, dark and still. I was about to shine the light inside when Derek's voice came from behind me. "What's going on?" I spun around, the flashlight shaking in my hand. Derek stood there, bleary-eyed, emerging from the trees, a confused look on his face. "I had to take a piss. Why the hell are you standing by my tent?" I looked back at his tent, the flap still open, and my blood ran cold. I thought you were inside." Derek frowned. "No, man. I was over there." He pointed toward the woods, the spot where he must have wandered off to relieve himself. Slowly, I turned the flashlight back to the tent. There was no movement, no sound, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been inside it. Something had unzipped it. We didn't say much after that. Derek saw the look on my face and knew something was wrong, but he didn't push. We both crawled into our tents, but I didn't sleep. Not really. Every little noise, every gust of wind, felt like something was creeping closer. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I knew, it was dawn. Pale light filtered through the trees and the campsite looked normal again. Quiet. Peaceful, even. Derek was already up packing his things. "Let's get the hell out of here," he said, not meeting my eyes. I didn't argue. We packed up in record time, and within an hour we were on the road, the campsite shrinking into the distance behind us. But as we drove, Derek broke the silence. "You saw it, didn't you?" I glanced at him, my throat tight. "Saw what?" "The Watcher," he said quietly. "I saw it too. Last night, just before I went into the woods." My skin crawled. "What did you see?" He hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. "It was tall, dark, just standing there by the trees. I thought it was just a shadow at first, but then it moved." I didn't say anything, but my mind raced back to the footsteps, the unzipped tent, the feeling of being watched. "I think it followed us," Derek said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want to believe him. I wanted to tell myself it was all in our heads, that we were just spooked from being out in the woods. But even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling that something is still watching me. I wasn't supposed to go camping that weekend. My friend Nate had begged me to come along, but something about it didn't sit right with me. It wasn't the usual spot we went to. This one was deep in the forest, way off the beaten path. No cell service, no other campers for miles. Just thick woods and a small, secluded lake. Nate loved that kind of isolation. Me, not so much. But he wore me down. He promised it would be fun, just a couple of nights away from civilization. A few beers by the fire, maybe some fishing. He said the spot was perfect, untouched, like stepping back in time. And that's exactly what it felt like when we arrived. The forest there was old, not just old, but ancient. The kind of place that felt heavy, like it had secrets buried deep in its roots. As we hiked in, the trees towered over us, their branches twisting into unnatural shapes. It was almost like they were leaning in, watching. I kept my head down, trying to ignore the feeling of unease gnawing at the back of my mind. By the time we reached the lake, the sun was already dipping behind the hills. The water was still, reflecting the darkening sky like a mirror. It was beautiful, but in that eerie, untouched way, like it hadn't seen a human presence in centuries. Nate, of course, was thrilled. He dropped his pack, stretched his arms wide, and declared it the best campsite ever. I wasn't so sure. We set up camp near the lake, built a fire, and cracked open a couple of beers. Nate was in his element, talking about all the things he wanted to do. Fishing, hiking deeper into the woods, maybe even staying an extra night. I tried to relax, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't supposed to be there. The forest was too quiet, no birds, no insects, just the occasional creak of the trees as the wind moved through them. I could feel the tension in the air, like something was watching us from the shadows just beyond the firelight. That's when Nate brought up the old story. "You know the legend of this place, right?" he asked, a grin spreading across his face. He loved this kind of stuff. Spooky stories, urban legends, anything to get a rise out of me. I shook my head, not really in the mood for it. Don't tell me. Let me guess. Haunted forest, cursed lake, something creepy in the woods? He laughed. Close. They say a long time ago, some settlers came through here, back when the area was still being explored. They tried to settle near the lake, but something went wrong. People started disappearing. Some were found later wandering the woods totally out of it, like they'd lost their minds. Others, they just vanished. I rolled my eyes, though the uneasy feeling in my gut grew stronger. So, what happened to them? Nate shrugged, his grin fading slightly. No one really knows. Some say they were driven mad by something out here, something in the woods. Others say they were taken. Taken by what? I asked, unable to stop myself. Nate glanced at the trees, the firelight flickering in his eyes. The forest itself. They say it's alive, that it watches anyone who comes here. And if it doesn't want you here, well, it takes you. I laughed, trying to break the tension, but the sound came out forsaid. Right. Well, let's hope the forest likes us, then. He smirked, but I could tell the story had gotten under his skin too. We didn't talk much after that, just sat in silence, listening to the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind in the trees. That's when I heard it, a faint sound barely audible over the wind. It was a soft, distant humming, like someone singing far away. I straightened up, thinking maybe it was the wind playing tricks on my ears, but it kept going, growing louder. Nate, do you hear that? I whispered. He nodded, his face pale in the firelight. Yeah, it's coming from the woods. We both turned toward the tree line, staring into the darkness. The sound was growing clearer now. It wasn't just humming. It was a voice, a woman's voice, singing something slow and haunting, the melody twisting through the trees like a snake. My heart started to pound. Who the hell would be out here? Nate shook his head. No one. No one's supposed to be out here but us. The voice was getting closer, but we still couldn't see anything. The firelight flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to shift and move. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and that gut feeling, the one I'd had since we arrived, was screaming at me to get the hell out of there. Maybe it's someone who got lost, Nate said, though he didn't sound convinced. I stood up, grabbing the flashlight, shining it toward the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. No movement, no sign of anyone, just the trees, standing like silent sentinels. Then, the voice stopped. Dead silence. I lowered the flashlight, my heart still racing. Maybe we should... A loud snap came from the trees behind us like a branch breaking underfoot. We both spun around, shining our lights in the direction of the sound. But again, nothing. No one. Just the forest. Nate, we should go, I said, my voice barely a whisper, now. He didn't argue. We started packing up as fast as we could, throwing things into our bags without bothering to organize. The air felt heavy, thick, like we were being watched from all sides. The trees seemed closer now, like they'd moved in while we weren't looking, their branches twisting together, blocking out the sky. As we grabbed the last of our gear, the voice started again, closer this time. It was right at the edge of the lake. We turned, and there, standing on the water, not in it but on it, was a figure, a woman, or at least what looked like a woman. She was pale, her skin almost glowing in the darkness, her hair hanging wet and limp around her face. She stood perfectly still, her feet just inches above the water's surface, and she was staring right at us. I froze. My mind refused to process what I was seeing. It wasn't possible. People don't stand on water. They don't look like that. Nate, I croaked, my throat tight. But Nate was already moving, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the trail. We didn't look back. We just ran, our footsteps pounding against the dirt, the sound of our breath ragged and panicked in the cold night air. The singing followed us, fainter now but still there, echoing through the trees. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. We threw our gear in the back, jumped in, and peeled out of there, the tires kicking up dirt as we sped away. Neither of us said a word for the first hour of the drive. Finally, Nate broke the silence. "What the hell was that?" I didn't answer. I didn't know. All I knew was that something was out there, something that didn't want us in those woods. And as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching us. Even now, weeks later, I still hear that faint, haunting melody in my dreams. And I haven't been camping since. I had always loved camping, especially the feeling of disconnecting from the world and immersing myself in nature. This trip was supposed to be no different. It was just me and my buddy Mark, heading out to a remote spot we found on an old hiking forum. The kind of place where GPS signals die and cell reception is non-existent. Perfect for a weekend getaway, right? The drive took us deep into the mountains, far away from any towns or people. As we arrived at the trailhead, the sun was already beginning to set, casting long shadows across the dense forest. The trees felt ancient, looming over us like silent sentinels. There was an eerie stillness in the air, but we shrugged it off. It was just nature after all. We hiked for about an hour before we reached the clearing where we planned to set up camp. It was a wide, flat patch of earth surrounded by thick woods on all sides, and beyond the trees, we could hear the faint sound of a stream trickling nearby. It seemed perfect. We pitched our tent, started a fire, and settled in for a quiet night under the stars. But as night fell, that stillness I noticed earlier turned into something else, a kind of suffocating silence. No wind, no rustling leaves, not even the chirp of crickets. Mark joked about it being too quiet, but I could tell he felt it too. Around midnight, we started hearing the noises. At first, it was just a light rustling in the bushes. Probably a raccoon or something, we thought. But then there was a strange clicking sound, like two stones being tapped together. It was slow, rhythmic, coming from the edge of the tree line. We both fell silent, listening. The sound continued for a few minutes, then stopped suddenly. Mark tried to laugh it off, saying it was just some weird animal, but I could hear the unease in his voice. We both stared into the darkness beyond the firelight, trying to convince ourselves it was nothing. The clicking came back. This time it was closer. I stood up, shining my flashlight towards the trees, but the beam only seemed to deepen the darkness. The shadows felt thicker, like they were moving just out of view. And then, just as quickly as it started, the clicking stopped again. The silence returned, even more oppressive than before. We sat by the fire for what felt like hours, waiting, listening. Eventually, Mark suggested we call it a night and head into the tent. Maybe if we ignored it, whatever it was would go away. But sleep didn't come easy. Every creak of the tent, every gust of wind, it all sounded too close, too deliberate. I could hear Mark tossing and turning beside me, just as restless. Sometime in the dead of night, I woke up to a noise that sent a chill down my spine. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps, crunching the leaves just outside the tent. They were slow, like someone was walking around, taking their time, inspecting us. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped right outside the tent. I could hear the faint sound of breathing, long, deep breaths. Something or someone was standing just inches from us. Then came the scraping. It was a soft, slow drag, like nails or claws raking against the fabric of the tent. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body was frozen. Mark was awake too. I could hear him muttering under his breath, "What the hell is that?" We stayed still, paralyzed by fear, as the scraping continued. Then suddenly it stopped. The footsteps retreated, fading back into the woods. The silence returned, but this time it felt even worse. Like something was watching, waiting. Neither of us slept after that. We sat in the tent, wide-eyed, until the first light of dawn broke through the trees. Without saying a word, we packed up camp as quickly as we could, eager to leave whatever had stalked us during the night. As we hiked back to the car, the forest felt different, more alive, but in a wrong kind of way. The birds were back, the wind rustled through the trees, but that feeling of being watched never left. We didn't talk much on the drive home. What could we even say? But before we left the mountains, we made one stop at a small diner on the edge of the nearest town. We were desperate to shake off the dread, to feel normal again. As we sat there sipping coffee, we overheard a conversation between two locals at the counter. "Did you hear they found another body up in the woods near Dead Man's Creek?" one of them said. My blood ran cold. "Yeah, second one this month. Sheriff thinks it's a bear, but I don't know," the other replied. "Folks around here say it's something else. Something older." I exchanged a look with Mark, and we didn't need to say anything. We both knew. Whatever was out there that night, it wasn't just an animal. It was something watching us, hunting us, and we were lucky to have made it out alive. Now every time I hear the click of stones, I remember that night in the woods, and I wonder how close we came to being the next ones they found. I'll be the first to admit I'm not the outdoorsy type, but when my best friend, Hannah, insisted we take a weekend camping trip to unplug, I went along with it. It was her idea of a birthday gift. A couple of nights in nature, no phones, no distractions. Just the two of us and a place she'd been going to with her family for years, Lake Cedarwood. Hannah swore it was a hidden gem deep in the woods and miles from any town. "It's always been so peaceful," she said on the drive there. "You'll love it." By the time we reached the lake, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting the water in a soft, golden glow. It was beautiful. I couldn't deny that. The lake was perfectly still, like a sheet of glass, reflecting the dense forest surrounding it. The silence was almost eerie, though. No birds, no wind, not even the usual buzzing of insects. Just stillness. We found a clearing by the lake's edge and set up camp, the only sounds being our movements and the occasional splash of a fish in the water. After a simple dinner by the campfire, we sat quietly, watching the stars blink into view above us. The lake was a dark mirror, perfectly reflecting the night sky. As the fire crackled and the night grew colder, Hannah nudged me. "Want to go for a quick night swim? It'll be fun." I hesitated. The lake looked so unnaturally still, but I didn't want to be a buzzkill, so I agreed. We stripped down to our swimsuits and waded into the water, which was surprisingly warm, like bath water, despite the cool night air. The surface barely rippled as we swam out a little way from shore, the quiet of the lake wrapping around us like a thick blanket. We floated on our backs for a while, staring up at the stars, laughing softly about old memories. It was nice, peaceful, until I noticed something off. I glanced over at Hannah, and that's when I saw it. In the water beside her, there was another figure, a reflection, just like ours. But it wasn't hers, and it wasn't mine. It was someone else. I shot up, treading water as my heart raced. The reflection floated just beside Hannah, rippling faintly, but staying there, like it belonged in the water. I couldn't make out a face, just the dark outline of a person standing on the surface of the water, staring down at us. "Hannah," I whispered, my voice trembling. She looked over at me, confused. "What?" I pointed to the water, trying to speak, but the words caught in my throat. Her eyes followed my hand, and for a moment she didn't react. Then, slowly, her face paled. The reflection was still there, hovering beside her in the water. It didn't move. It just stared. Without another word, we both swam frantically back to shore, scrambling out of the water, gasping for breath. When we turned back to the lake, there was nothing. The reflection, the figure, it was gone. The water was still again, as if nothing had happened. "What the hell was that?" I asked, my voice shaking. Hannah didn't answer. She just stared at the lake, her eyes wide with fear. We didn't talk much after that. We just dried off and retreated to the tent, locking ourselves inside. I lay awake for hours, listening to the silence, waiting for some sound, some explanation. But the night stayed quiet. The next morning we woke up early, both eager to leave. As we packed up the campsite, I couldn't stop glancing at the lake. The water was calm, glistening under the morning sun, completely normal. It almost felt like we had imagined the whole thing. As we were about to leave, I walked to the edge of the water one last time. The lake was so still, so clear, that I could see my reflection perfectly. And that's when I noticed something again. There, standing beside my reflection, was another figure. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. It was the same figure from the night before, dark, indistinct, standing beside me in the water. But this time, as I stared, it slowly raised its hand and waved. I backed away, stumbling over the rocks as Hannah came over. "What's wrong?" she asked, seeing the panic on my face. I didn't say anything. I just pointed at the lake, but when she looked, the figure was gone. The water was empty, still reflecting nothing but the trees and sky. There was no sign of the dark figure. It was as if it had never been there, but I knew what I'd seen. We both had. We left Lake Cedarwood in silence, neither of us willing to talk about it. I haven't been camping since, and I never plan to go back. But sometimes when I pass a pond or catch a glimpse of myself in a puddle after a rainstorm, I swear I see it. That figure standing just beside my reflection, just watching and waiting. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the cool night air as I leaned back against my backpack, staring up at the thick canopy of trees above us. The sky was barely visible through the dense branches, and the stars that managed to peek through seemed cold and distant. My friends Ethan and Jess were sitting across from me, warming their hands by the fire. It was supposed to be a perfect weekend, 3 days deep in the forest, far from cell service, far from work, far from the stress of life, just us and nature. But something was off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but from the moment we set up camp earlier that evening, a strange unease had settled over me. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no rustling in the underbrush, not even the sound of wind through the trees. It was as if the woods were holding their breath, waiting. Ethan seemed oblivious, poking the fire with a stick. "Man, this place is amazing," he said, his voice breaking the silence that had been lingering between us. "We should come out here more often." Jess nodded, but her eyes kept darting around the perimeter of our camp. I wasn't the only one feeling uneasy. "Yeah, it's beautiful, but I don't know. There's something weird about these woods." I glanced at her. "You feel it too?" She nodded slowly, her face illuminated by the flickering flames. "It's like we're being watched." Ethan laughed, trying to brush it off. "Come on, you guys, it's just your mind playing tricks on you. We're out in the middle of nowhere. Of course it feels a little creepy." But Jess and I weren't convinced. The feeling was too strong to ignore. As the night wore on, we tried to shake it off, talking and joking around, but the tension in the air never really left. Eventually, we all decided to call it a night. Jess went to her tent, Ethan to his, and I was left alone by the fire, staring into the dying embers, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination. That's when I heard it. A low, distant howl carried on the still air. It wasn't a wolf. It was deeper, more guttural, like something trying to mimic a wolf's howl but not quite getting it right. My skin prickled, and I stood up, scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. The howl came again, this time closer. I grabbed my flashlight, flicking it on, the beam cutting through the blackness. The trees loomed like silent sentinels around me, their branches twisting in unnatural shapes. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I slowly turned in a circle, listening. Then, footsteps, light, almost imperceptible but unmistakable. Something was moving through the forest, slowly, deliberately. "Ethan," I called, my voice barely more than a whisper. No answer. "Jess?" Still nothing. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The footsteps stopped. Silence. For a long moment, all I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, telling myself it was just an animal. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the firelight just inside the tree line. Tall, thin, unnaturally still. My breath caught in my throat as I turned the flashlight towards it. It was Jess. Or at least it looked like her. But something was wrong. She was standing too rigid, her arms hanging limply at her sides, her head tilted at an odd angle. Her eyes, wide, unblinking, stared straight ahead, unfocused. "Jess," I whispered, my voice shaking. "What are you doing?" She didn't respond. She just stood there, staring, her body swaying slightly, like a puppet hanging from invisible strings. A chill crawled down my spine, and I took a step back. "Jess?" Then she smiled. But it wasn't her smile. It was too wide, too forced, stretching her lips in a grotesque imitation of a human expression. Her teeth gleamed in the firelight, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. That's when she spoke. "I'm fine," she said, but the voice, it wasn't hers. It sounded like her, but there was something off. A distortion, like a recording played at the wrong speed. "Come into the woods with me." Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. I stood frozen, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. "Come with me," she repeated, stepping closer, her movements jerky, unnatural. Behind her, deeper in the forest, I saw something else. Another figure standing in the shadows watching, taller, darker. Its eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the darkness. My stomach lurched as I realized it was the source of the howling. It was watching Jess, or whatever had taken her form. "Come with me," she said again, her voice breaking, glitching. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet. I turned and bolted for Ethan's tent, my heart slamming against my ribs. I threw open the flap and shook him awake. "Ethan, get up. There's something out there," I hissed, my voice trembling. He groggily sat up, rubbing his eyes. What are you talking about?" "Jess, there's something wrong with her. We have to go." But before I could finish, the tent flap slowly unzipped behind me. Ethan froze, his eyes going wide as he stared over my shoulder. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to see it, but I had to. Slowly I turned, my heart hammering in my chest. Jess stood there in the entrance, her face twisted into that same unnatural smile. Her eyes, empty hollow, locked onto mine. And then she spoke again. But this time, it wasn't her voice. It was mine. "Come into the woods with me," she said, her lips curling into that horrible grin. I didn't wait. I grabbed Ethan, yanking him out of the tent, and we ran, blindly, recklessly, into the night. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees twisting and contorting as we crashed through the underbrush. Behind us, I could hear her, hear it. The thing that wore Jess's face. And worse. I could hear something else. A second voice, Ethan's. "Come into the woods with me," it whispered, closer than it should have been. We didn't stop running until we reached the ranger station at the edge of the park. When we burst through the door, out of breath and panicked, the ranger looked up at us with wide eyes. "You're lucky," he said, shaking his head slowly. "Not many people make it back from those woods." We never found Jess. I never believed in cryptids or any of that supernatural nonsense. My idea of a scary story involved a good thriller movie, maybe a haunted house tour around Halloween. Real-life horror was just, well, real. Bills, jobs, and responsibilities. But I'll never be the same after what happened on that camping trip last fall. It was supposed to be a solo trip, just me and nature. I needed a break from the grind, from people, from everything. The forest always helped me clear my head, and this time I was going deeper than ever before into the wilderness of Montana. No campsites, no trails, just a map, a compass, and miles of untouched forest. The first 2 days were bliss. The air was crisp, the forest was alive, and I didn't see a single soul. I pitched my tent on the third night at the edge of a small clearing. The sun was setting behind the trees, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, casting long shadows across the ground. As the darkness crept in, I built a fire and settled in with a book. The crackling of the fire and the soft chirp of crickets were the only sounds for miles. It was perfect. But that night, something changed. It started subtly. The fire was getting low, and as I went to throw another log on it, I heard something. It wasn't loud, just a faint rustling from the tree line. At first, I figured it was an animal, a deer or maybe a raccoon scavenging. I didn't think much of it. Then I heard it again. This time it was louder, closer, twigs snapping. I turned my flashlight toward the woods, scanning the dense brush. Nothing. Just shadows and trees swaying in the wind. I shrugged it off, but the hairs on the back of my neck prickled as I sat back down by the fire. That's when I noticed it. Silence. The crickets had stopped. The wind had died down. The woods were unnaturally quiet, like the forest was holding its breath. And in that silence, I felt it. That creeping sensation. The one that claws at your gut and tells you something isn't right. Like eyes were on me. Watching. Waiting. I stood up, scanning the tree line again with my flashlight. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. Nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just beyond the light of my fire, hiding in the dark. I threw another log onto the fire, hoping the flames would push back the shadows, give me some comfort. But the feeling didn't go away. It only grew stronger. I tried to distract myself, went back to reading, but my eyes kept flicking up, scanning the woods. It felt like the darkness was pressing in, suffocating. A sudden loud crack snapped me out of my thoughts. My heart leapt into my throat, and I jumped to my feet, shining the flashlight toward the noise. I was sure I'd see an animal, maybe a bear lumbering through the underbrush. But there was nothing. Nothing except the faintest glimpse of movement. A shadow, impossibly tall, slipping between the trees. My stomach turned as I realized the shadow had been standing still, blending in with the trunks, watching me. It had only moved when the beam of my light swept over it. My breath hitched, and I stepped back toward the fire. The temperature had dropped suddenly, and a chill crept through me. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I had seen. Maybe it was a trick of the light, the fire casting strange shadows. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something was out there. I sat by the fire for what felt like hours, gripping my flashlight, my ears straining for any sound. The woods had come alive again, but not in the way I wanted. Every little noise, every rustle, every snap of a twig sent my heart racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there was getting closer. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have drifted off, because the next thing I knew, I woke to the sound of heavy breathing. It was faint but distinct, and it wasn't mine. My eyes snapped open, and I stayed perfectly still, listening. The fire had burned low, barely more than embers now, casting long shadows that danced across the clearing. The breathing came again, deep, slow, and ragged, like it was coming from something large. I turned my head ever so slightly, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. And then I saw it. Just beyond the edge of the clearing, standing between two trees, was a figure. It was tall, too tall, towering over the bushes, its outline barely visible in the faint glow of the dying fire. My heart hammered in my chest as I tried to make sense of it. At first I thought it was a person, but no human could stand that tall, not without some kind of unnatural distortion. Its limbs were elongated, unnaturally thin, and its head, God, its head, was wrong. too narrow, almost like a deer's skull but stretched and twisted. I could feel its eyes on me, though I couldn't see them. Just black, empty voids where its face should be. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe, my body was frozen with fear as the thing just stood there watching me. Then, without warning, it moved. It didn't walk, it didn't even seem to shift its weight. One moment it was standing still, and the next, it was gliding, sliding through the trees like a shadow, noiseless and impossibly fast. It circled the edge of the clearing, always staying just out of the fire's dying light. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I was rooted to the spot, my hands shaking as I clutched the flashlight. The thing kept circling, moving faster now, closer. Then it stopped, right at the edge of the firelight. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel it. It was waiting. Suddenly the fire flared, casting a brief flash of light, and for the first time I saw its face. It wasn't a deer, it wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. Its skin was pale and stretched too tight over its bones, its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, sharp teeth glinting in the firelight. Its eyes, if you could call them that, were sunken, black pits, hollow and endless. In that split second, I knew I wasn't making it out of there. But then it did something I didn't expect. It turned its head slowly toward the woods behind me, like it had seen something. And then it ran, not toward me, but away, vanishing into the trees without a sound. I didn't wait to find out why. I grabbed my pack, bolted for the trail, and didn't stop running until I reached my car, miles away. I don't know what that thing was, and I don't want to know. But I do know this. There was something else in those woods that night, something even it was afraid of. Camping had always been my escape. The world felt small and manageable in the quiet of the woods under the stars, with just a fire and the sounds of nature. I never imagined something so serene could become so wrong. This time I went alone. I needed the space, the solitude. Work had been stressful, life even more so. My friends had warned me not to go by myself, said it wasn't safe, but I brushed them off. I'd done this plenty of times before. I found a perfect spot, far off the main trail, near a small stream, surrounded by towering trees that blotted out most of the sky. The forest felt ancient, untouched, and utterly still. The kind of place where you could forget the rest of the world existed. I set up camp, built a fire, and settled in as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows through the trees. As darkness crept in, the woods became eerily silent. No animals rustling through the leaves, no distant calls of birds, just the crackling of the fire and the occasional breeze whispering through the branches. It felt wrong, but I chalked it up to my imagination. Being alone in the wilderness could mess with your head. I decided to turn in early, the exhaustion of the week catching up with me. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, the warmth of the fire outside barely reaching the tent. I drifted off quickly, the quiet of the forest lulling me to sleep. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but something had pulled me out of a deep sleep. I lay there, disoriented, listening to the silence outside. And then I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from outside the tent, somewhere in the trees. At first I thought it was a branch knocking against something, but the sound was too deliberate, too steady. My heart began to race, but I told myself it was probably just some animal, maybe a woodpecker, though the tapping didn't sound like that either. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening. The tapping would stop for a few minutes, then start again, always the same pace, always from the same direction. Eventually, exhaustion won over my fear, and I drifted back to sleep. When I woke the next morning, I felt uneasy. The fire had long since died, and the forest was as still and quiet as it had been the night before. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, that something had been close during the night. I walked to the edge of the clearing, trying to see if there was anything unusual in the trees, but there was nothing. No sign of animals, no footprints, just undisturbed dirt and leaves. I convinced myself I was being paranoid. It's easy to get spooked when you're out here alone. Still, I couldn't shake the tension in my chest, so I decided to take a hike to clear my head, get some distance from camp. The forest felt suffocating as I walked, the trees looming overhead like silent sentinels, their branches thick and intertwined, blocking out the sun. The trail I followed was barely visible, more of a suggestion than a path winding deeper into the woods. The further I went, the stronger that feeling grew. The sense that I wasn't alone, that something was watching me. Then up ahead I saw it. At first I thought it was a trick of the light or maybe my mind playing games with me. But as I got closer I realized what I was looking at. A tree, its bark stripped away in long, jagged lines, like something had clawed at it. Deep gouges ran down the trunk, fresh enough that the wood beneath was still pale and raw. I stopped dead in my tracks, my stomach twisting. What kind of animal could do that? The claw marks were too large, too deep. It looked more like the work of a person than any creature I'd ever encountered in these woods. As I stood there, staring at the tree, the tapping sound returned. Soft, steady. Tap, tap, tap. This time it was closer. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing there. Just the thick, oppressive trees closing in on all sides. The tapping stopped, leaving me in the deafening silence of the forest. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to run, to get the hell out of there, but another part of me, the part that's always been too curious for its own good, needed to know what was making that sound. I followed the noise. It led me deeper into the woods, the tapping growing louder, more insistent. My heart raced, my palms sweaty as I gripped the knife I'd brought along, though I wasn't sure what good it would do. The trees seemed to press in closer the further I went, their branches twisting and tangling overhead, blocking out most of the light. And then I saw it. A cabin. Small, run down, almost hidden by the overgrowth of the forest. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, its wooden walls rotting, the roof sagging in places. But the tapping was coming from inside. I should have turned back. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave, to run. But I didn't. Instead, I approached the cabin, my footsteps barely making a sound in the thick layer of leaves and dirt. The front door was ajar, creaking softly as it moved with the breeze. I hesitated, staring at the dark space beyond. The tapping had stopped again, leaving the woods eerily quiet. I stepped inside. The air inside the cabin was stale, thick with the smell of rot and damp wood. The floor creaked under my weight as I moved further in, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. The cabin was empty. No furniture, no signs of life, just dirt and decay. And then from behind me the tapping started again. I whipped around, my flashlight scanning the room, but there was nothing. Just the cabin, empty and silent. Suddenly the door slammed shut, plunging me into darkness. I ran to the door, fumbling with the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me as the tapping grew louder, faster. It was right behind me now, almost rhythmic, like a heartbeat. My breath came in short gasps as I turned, pressing my back to the door, my flashlight shaking in my hand. And that's when I saw it. In the corner of the room, crouched low to the ground, was a figure. Its limbs were long, too long, twisted and wrong. Its skin was pale and slick, like it had been stretched too tight over its bones. It stared at me with hollow, empty eyes, its mouth hanging open in a grotesque grin. The tapping had stopped. It didn't need to make a sound anymore. It was there, right in front of me. I didn't wait. I threw myself at the door, pounding on it, screaming until finally it gave way. I stumbled out into the forest, my legs weak, my mind reeling. I ran, blindly, crashing through the underbrush, not caring where I was going as long as it was away from that thing. I don't know how long I ran, hours maybe. By the time I stopped, I was lost, completely disoriented, my camp nowhere in sight. But I didn't care. I just kept moving, putting as much distance between me and that cabin as possible. I never went back for my tent, my gear. I never went back for anything. When I finally made it back to civilization, I didn't tell anyone what had happened. Who would believe me? But sometimes late at night when the world is quiet, I can still hear it. That soft, steady tapping. The first few hours of the camping trip were like any other. We hiked deep into the forest, far away from the crowded campsites and well-trodden trails, determined to find somewhere secluded. It was just me, my best friend Eric, and his girlfriend Megan. The three of us had planned this trip for weeks, a quick weekend getaway to escape our busy lives. We found the perfect spot, an open clearing surrounded by thick trees with a small bubbling creek nearby. The sound of the water was calming, and the air smelled like pine and earth. The first night we built a fire, roasted marshmallows, and shared stories under a blanket of stars. Everything felt right, peaceful. But that feeling didn't last. It started in the middle of the second night. I woke up in my tent to the sound of something moving outside. At first I thought it was just the wind, maybe some branches scraping against each other. But the longer I lay there listening, the more I realized it wasn't the wind at all. It was footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps. They crunched softly over the dried leaves, circled the camp, and then stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear anything, but there was only silence. After a few moments, I told myself it had to be an animal, maybe a deer or some other curious creature. I forced myself to relax, but sleep didn't come easily. Something felt off, like the air had shifted. Heavy, oppressive. The next morning over breakfast, I asked if anyone else had heard anything. Eric shook his head, focused on cooking eggs over the fire. Megan, though, frowned, her eyes darting toward the tree line. "I thought I heard something too," she said quietly, "like someone walking around the tents." Eric laughed. "Probably just a raccoon or something. These woods are full of animals." But the look on Megan's face told me she wasn't convinced, and honestly, neither was I. That afternoon, we decided to explore deeper into the forest, following the creek upstream. It was beautiful, serene, the kind of place you see on postcards. But as we hiked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every time I turned around, expecting to see someone or something behind us, there was nothing, just trees and shadows. About an hour into the hike, we stumbled across something strange. An old, dilapidated cabin, half hidden behind a tangle of overgrown bushes. It looked ancient, like it hadn't been touched in decades. The wood was rotting, the roof caved in on one side. There was no sign of a path or road leading to it, and it definitely wasn't on the map we brought. "Whoa," Eric said, stepping closer. "How do you think this got here?" "Maybe it's an old ranger cabin," Megan suggested, though her voice wavered with uncertainty. "Or a hunting lodge." We circled the structure, curiosity getting the better of us. I peeked through one of the broken windows, half expecting to see nothing but cobwebs and decay. But inside, there were strange carvings on the walls, symbols I didn't recognize, etched deep into the wood, like someone had deliberately carved them there. "Let's go in," Eric said, already moving toward the door. "Are you serious?" Megan shot back, her tone sharp. "That place looks like it's ready to collapse." Eric waved her off. "Come on, it's just a quick look. We'll be fine." Reluctantly, Megan and I followed him inside. The air in the cabin was thick, musty, with a faint, sour smell that made my stomach turn. The carvings on the walls were even stranger up close. Spirals, jagged lines, symbols that felt wrong somehow. "This is creepy," Megan muttered, rubbing her arms as if the temperature had dropped. Eric, unfazed, wandered further inside, but I stayed by the door, unease settling deep in my gut. Something about the place felt wrong, like it was hiding a secret, something we weren't supposed to see. That's when we found the trapdoor. It was half buried beneath a pile of debris, but Eric spotted the edge and cleared the rest of it off. The wooden door was old, splintered, with a rusted metal handle. "No way," I said, backing up. "We are not going down there." Eric, of course, was already pulling the trapdoor open, revealing a set of stairs descending into darkness. The smell that wafted up was worse than the mustiness in the cabin. It was foul, like something had died down there. "Eric, don't," Megan whispered, her voice trembling. "Let's just go back to camp." Eric paused, looking down into the dark void, and for a moment I thought he was going to listen to her. But then he smirked. "What's the worst that could happen?" He took a step down, then another. "Eric," I called, but my voice sounded small, almost swallowed by the cabin itself. He disappeared into the darkness, leaving Megan and me standing there, our hearts pounding. Seconds stretched into minutes, and then nothing. No sound. No movement. "Eric," Megan called, her voice shaking. "This isn't funny." I grabbed my flashlight and shined it down the stairs. The beam barely penetrated the thick darkness below. "Megan, wait here, I'll go get him." Before she could protest, I started down the stairs, every fiber of my being screaming at me to turn back. The steps creaked under my weight, and the foul smell grew stronger with every breath. As I reached the bottom, my flashlight flickered and went out. Panic surged through me as I fumbled to turn it back on. The darkness was suffocating, pressing in from all sides. But then, as the light blinked back to life, I saw it. Eric was standing in the middle of a small dirt floor room, staring at the far wall. His back was to me, and for a moment, relief washed over me. I stepped forward, calling his name, but he didn't respond. "Eric?" He didn't move. My flashlight beam followed his gaze, and that's when I saw what he was looking at. Carved into the dirt wall was a door, not a real door, but an outline crudely scratched into the earth, and around it those same strange symbols from the cabin walls. "Eric, let's get out of here," I said, my voice cracking. But Eric didn't answer. He just kept staring, frozen, like he was in a trance. And then, in a voice that wasn't his, he whispered, "It's open." Suddenly the trapdoor above slammed shut, plunging us into darkness. I yelled for Megan, but the only sound was Eric's heavy breathing next to me. He turned slowly, and when the light hit his face, my stomach dropped. His eyes were blank, wide, and empty. "They're coming," he whispered. I bolted for the stairs, practically dragging Eric behind me. When we reached the top, I slammed into the trapdoor, pushing it open with all my strength. Megan was on the other side, screaming, her face pale as death. We didn't stop running until we reached the clearing where our tents were. Eric barely spoke for the rest of the night, his face slack and pale. We packed up and left at first light. On the drive home, no one said a word. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't escaped that place. Not really. Because ever since that night, I've been dreaming of that cabin, and in every dream, that carved door is waiting, and each time it's opened just a little bit wider. There are places in the world that feel untouched by time, places where the line between the real and the unreal blurs. I learned this the hard way on a camping trip last fall, a trip I won't ever forget, a trip that changed everything. It was me, my friend Kyle, and his younger brother Ethan. We were headed to the Pine Hollow Reserve, a thick forest way out in the countryside, miles from any sign of civilization. Kyle had heard about a hidden trail there, one that supposedly led to an old abandoned cabin deep in the woods. We were all experienced campers, so the idea of exploring a forgotten place excited us. We left early that Saturday, eager to find this so-called hidden trail. When we arrived at the reserve, the usual paths were well maintained, but Kyle wanted something different, something off the beaten track. So we hiked deep into the woods looking for any sign of a trail that had been neglected or overgrown. By mid-afternoon we found it, an old narrow path barely visible under the thick canopy of trees. It was covered in leaves and branches, clearly unused for years. But there was something about it that drew us in, something that made us feel like we had to follow it. We hiked for what felt like hours. The forest around us grew denser, darker. The trees seemed to close in, their twisted branches casting long, finger-like shadows across the ground. The further we went, the quieter it got. No birds, no wind, just the sound of our footsteps crunching through the leaves. Eventually, we found the cabin. It sat in a small clearing, hidden by the forest's dense growth. The wood was old and rotting, the windows shattered, the door hanging slightly ajar. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was the lantern hanging by the door. It was old, rusted, but the flame inside flickered faintly, as if it had been lit just minutes before. "Who the hell is out here?" Ethan muttered, glancing at me and Kyle. None of us had an answer. We hadn't seen another soul the entire hike. "Maybe it's someone's idea of a prank," Kyle said, though his voice wavered. Still, curiosity got the better of us. We approached the cabin cautiously, our eyes on the flickering lantern. There was no sign of anyone inside, just dust, cobwebs, and the faint smell of something rotting. Ethan reached for the lantern. Whoever left this must be around here somewhere. Maybe. Before he could finish, the lantern went out. Just like that, the flame vanished and the clearing was plunged into an eerie twilight. It felt like the air got colder, heavier. I don't know how to describe it, but it was like something had shifted, like the forest had come alive and was watching us. "We should go," I said, my voice tight. Kyle nodded, and Ethan, for once, didn't argue. We backed away from the cabin, trying to retrace our steps down the trail. But the trail wasn't there anymore. The path we had come in on, the one we'd followed for hours, it was gone. No faint track in the leaves, no break in the trees. Just an unbroken wall of forest all around us. "Did we take a wrong turn?" Kyle asked, sounding more panicked than I'd ever heard him. "No," I replied, scanning the dense woods. "We didn't." The sun was sinking lower, and the shadows in the forest were growing longer. We had no choice but to keep moving, hoping we'd somehow find our way back. But as we walked, that feeling of being watched grew stronger. The silence around us was thick, oppressive, like the whole forest was holding its breath. Then we heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind us. Slow, steady, just far enough away that we couldn't see who or what was following us. We turned, but there was nothing there, just trees and darkness. "Did you hear that?" Ethan asked, his voice shaking. "Yeah, we heard it," Kyle muttered, gripping the flashlight tightly. We picked up the pace, but the footsteps followed, always keeping just enough distance to stay out of sight. And then, in the distance, we saw it, the flicker of a light. A lantern. It was the same one from the cabin, swinging slowly between the trees, its flame glowing faintly in the growing darkness. But there was no one holding it. It moved on its own, gliding through the woods as if being carried by invisible hands. "Is that the same lantern?" Kyle whispered, though we all knew the answer. None of us moved. We just stood there frozen, watching as the lantern bobbed closer. That's when I saw him. A figure appeared in the light, just behind the lantern. Tall, impossibly tall, with long, thin limbs and a face I couldn't quite make out. His body seemed to fade into the shadows, his movements slow and deliberate, but his eyes, they were wide and dark, and they locked onto us. "Run," I whispered, barely able to get the word out. We ran. I don't think I've ever been so scared in my life. We sprinted through the forest, branches slapping our faces, the sound of our own breathing ragged in the still air. But no matter how fast we ran, I could feel it, the presence behind us, the footsteps growing louder, closer. Every time I looked back, the lantern was there, swinging slowly, the figure always just behind it, always watching. We ran until we couldn't anymore, our legs burning, lungs aching. When we finally stopped, gasping for breath, the lantern had disappeared, the footsteps gone. But we were still lost. The forest felt endless, like it was swallowing us whole. The trees twisted in ways that didn't make sense. The sky above seemed darker than it should have been, and the silence. The silence was suffocating. "We have to keep moving," Kyle said. though he looked like he was barely holding it together. And so we did. We walked for hours, maybe longer, the woods stretching on forever. And just when I thought we were doomed, that we'd never find our way out, we stumbled onto the road. It was sudden. One minute we were surrounded by trees. The next we were standing on the old dirt road that led back to the reserve parking lot. Relief flooded through us. We didn't question it. We just ran. When we reached the car, the sun was just starting to rise, casting a pale light over the forest. We piled in, none of us saying a word, and Kyle floored it. We didn't talk about the lantern, not until a few days later, when I decided to look up the history of Pine Hollow Reserve. That's when I found the story. Years ago, a man had lived in the cabin near the river, a recluse, or so the locals said. He was known for wandering the woods at night with an old lantern, searching for something, though no one knew what. One night he disappeared and the cabin was left abandoned. But the legend remained. They called him the Lantern Man, a ghost said to haunt the deepest parts of the reserve, always searching, always watching. I don't know if what we saw that night was real, but I do know one thing. We weren't alone in those woods, and if you ever find yourself deep in Pine Hollow and you see the flicker of a lantern through the trees, do yourself a favor. Don't follow it. And whatever you do, don't look back. I've never been afraid of the woods, not like some people. Growing up in a small town surrounded by thick forests, I spent most of my childhood exploring trails, building forts, even camping alone as a teenager. The sounds of the woods, the rustling leaves, the distant calls of owls, the steady hum of insects, always felt like home to me. Until that night. I had decided to head out for a solo camping trip, something I did at least once every summer. A way to clear my head and get away from the constant barrage of screens, work, and noise. I picked a spot deep in the forest, about 10 miles from the nearest dirt road, far from any popular hiking paths. I wanted isolation. I got it. It was late afternoon by the time I reached the clearing, a small, flat area surrounded by towering pine trees. The air smelled fresh, earthy. There was a calmness to the place, a stillness that felt right. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and by the time the sun started to set, I had a fire going strong. I remember thinking how perfect it all was, the quiet, the solitude. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and the forest darkened, that feeling of peace began to slip away. At first, it was just little things. The way the trees seemed to close in around the clearing as the light faded. The way the shadows stretched and twisted in the firelight, making the forest seem more alive. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting the isolation get to me. But something felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to ignore it, sat by the fire, roasted some marshmallows, listened to the usual night sounds, crickets, wind in the trees, an occasional owl. But then there was something else, a rustling. At first I thought it was the wind, but this sound was different, more deliberate, like footsteps. I stood up, shining my flashlight into the woods. The beam cut through the darkness, but all I could see were trees. Still, that sound, the crunch of leaves, the snap of twigs, continued. It circled the campsite, slow and steady, just beyond the reach of the light. I called out, half expecting to see a deer or maybe a stray hiker who had wandered off course. But no one answered. The footsteps just stopped. I told myself it was an animal, nothing to worry about. I tried to laugh it off, even though every instinct I had was screaming that something wasn't right. I sat back down, poked at the fire, and listened. Everything was silent now. Too silent. The usual chorus of nighttime creatures had gone dead quiet. And then I heard it. A voice. At first it was faint. A whisper carried on the wind. So soft I almost didn't catch it. But as it continued, I realized it wasn't just any whisper. It was my name. Josh. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. I spun the flashlight around the clearing, trying to find the source of the voice, but there was no one there. The trees stood still, the shadows thick and unmoving. I felt the air grow colder. The voice came again, this time clearer, more distinct. "Josh, over here." It was coming from the trees just beyond the firelight. My blood ran cold, and I felt a wave of nausea. There was no way anyone could be out here. I was miles from the nearest road, and I hadn't seen another soul since I'd left my truck. But that voice, it sounded familiar. It sounded like my brother. But my brother had been dead for 5 years. I hadn't thought about him in months, maybe even years. His face flashed in my mind, a memory of the last time we'd camped together before the accident. It was a stupid thing, really. He had wandered off the trail while we were hiking, lost his footing, and fell into a ravine. They said he died instantly. I didn't see it happen, but I was there. I found him. His body had been twisted in ways I can't forget, no matter how much I try. But now his voice was calling me from the woods. I stood there, frozen, listening as it called again, more insistent this time. "Josh, come here. I need you." I should have left. I should have run straight to my tent, packed up, and gotten the hell out of there. But I didn't. Something about the voice, his voice, pulled at me. Against my better judgment, I stepped away from the fire, my flashlight shaking in my hand, and moved toward the trees. The moment I crossed into the darkness, the air felt wrong, heavy, oppressive. The temperature dropped, and the smell of damp earth and decay filled my nose. My flashlight flickered, the beam weak and sputtering. The voice came again, closer now, almost like it was right beside me. "I'm here, Josh, just a little further." I pushed deeper into the woods, the light barely cutting through the shadows. My heart raced, and my breath came in short, shallow bursts. Every step felt wrong, but I couldn't stop. My brother's voice kept pulling me forward. I reached a small clearing, the trees thinning out. The ground was covered in a thick layer of dead leaves, and at the center of it stood a figure. It was him, or it looked like him. His face was pale, too pale, and his eyes were sunken, dark pits that reflected no light. His body was gaunt, his limbs unnaturally long, and his skin seemed to hang loose on his bones. But it was his face, my brother's face. "Josh," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "I need you to come with me." I stumbled backward, my mind spinning, trying to process what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. My brother was dead, buried. This thing in front of me, it wasn't him. But as I stood there, frozen in place, it stepped toward me, its movements jerky, unnatural. "You left me," it hissed, its voice warping, distorting. "You let me die." I turned and ran. I didn't care where I was going. I just knew I had to get away. The trees seemed to close in around me, the darkness pressing down from all sides. The thing that looked like my brother screamed, an ear-piercing wail that echoed through the forest, chasing me. My legs burned as I ran, branches slapping my face, the cold air cutting into my lungs. But I didn't stop. When I finally burst back into my campsite, I collapsed near the fire, gasping for breath. The wailing had stopped. The forest was silent again, but I could feel it watching me. Whatever that thing was, it was still out there, waiting. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, clutching my flashlight, and waited for the sun to rise. The moment the first light broke through the trees, I packed up and left. I didn't look back. I couldn't. But even now, weeks later, I still hear it sometimes. That voice, my brother's voice, calling from the woods. I've always loved camping. Something about the solitude, the scent of pine, and the chill of a campfire night always felt like an escape from reality. Last weekend was no different, or so I thought. My best friend Danny and I planned to spend 3 nights deep in Black Creek Forest, a sprawling wilderness known for its untouched beauty and its strangeness. People talked about the weird stuff out there, ghostly noises, animals moving in ways they shouldn't, things they couldn't explain. But honestly, I never believed those stories. They always felt like tall tales designed to keep kids from wandering too far. So when Danny suggested Black Creek, I didn't hesitate. The first day was uneventful. We hiked until our legs ached and set up camp by a narrow stream that glistened in the late afternoon sun. As night fell, we built a fire, cracked open some beers, and settled into the comforting sounds of nature. Crickets chirped, and the stream's gentle flow provided a steady backdrop to our laughter. We were miles from any civilization, a perfect place to unwind, or so we thought. Around midnight, the first unsettling moment happened. We were sharing ghost stories the way you do when you're half drunk in the woods, when we heard a noise in the distance, a low, guttural growl, not the kind you'd expect from any normal animal. It was like a bear and a wolf tangled together, each trying to outdo the other in sheer menace. "Did you hear that?" I asked, looking toward the darkness beyond our firelight. Danny shrugged, trying to play it cool. "Just an animal, man. We're in its home, remember?" But I could see it in his eyes. He was nervous. We tried to laugh it off, but my gut told me something wasn't right. That growl sounded close, too close, like it knew we were there, and it didn't like it. But after half an hour of nothing else happening, we went to our tents, still joking, still pretending it was all okay. I woke up suddenly around 3 a.m., and I had no idea why. The air felt different, still, heavy, like it was holding its breath. I unzipped my tent just enough to peek outside, and that's when I saw it. A tall silhouette just barely visible against the moonlight standing at the edge of our campsite. It was humanoid, but its limbs were all wrong. Long, too long, and its head was tilted like it was listening. My heart raced, and I held my breath, praying it wouldn't notice me. Then it moved, slowly, deliberately. It stepped closer to the firelight, and I saw its eyes, glowing amber, piercing the night, staring directly into my tent. I closed my eyes, hoping it would go away, and after what felt like an eternity, I opened them again. It was gone. The next morning I told Danny what I saw, but he brushed it off. "Man, you were dreaming, or drunk. Come on, let's go for a hike. Clear your head." I agreed, but something gnawed at the back of my mind. Those eyes, they were too real. The hike only made things weirder. The forest felt different that day. Off. Every tree seemed to lean toward us, like it was listening. Birds didn't sing, and the wind had an eerie whistle that sounded almost human. Halfway up the trail, Danny stopped suddenly, eyes wide. "What is it?" I asked, trying to follow his gaze. "Shh. Did you hear that?" There it was again, a whisper, like someone murmuring just beyond the trees, but the words were garbled, twisted. We couldn't make them out. "Come on," Danny said, trying to sound brave, but I could see his hands shaking. We hurried back to camp, but that feeling of being watched never left. We agreed to pack up and leave the next morning, cutting our trip short. That night was worse, much worse. We tried to sleep, but the forest was alive with movement, branches snapping, leaves crunching, and the whispers. They were closer, circling our campsite. Around 2 a.m., I heard Danny whisper my name. Hey, get out here," he said, his voice low, almost trembling. I unzipped my tent and stepped out, and what I saw made my blood run cold. Standing at the edge of the trees just beyond the glow of our fire were several figures, tall, thin, with those same amber eyes I'd seen the night before. But there was something more disturbing. Their faces, they almost looked human. Almost. Like someone had taken a person's face and stretched it, twisted it into a permanent, unnatural grin. Is this Is this some kind of joke? Danny asked, his voice cracking. But I knew it wasn't. They were real, and they were getting closer. Then they spoke. The whispers turned into voices, garbled but recognizable. They sounded like us. Danny, why don't you stay, play with us, forever? It was my voice, my own voice coming from one of those twisted mouths. I grabbed Danny's arm. Run, I shouted, and we bolted through the forest, our flashlights darting in every direction, but the beams couldn't pierce the darkness. The whispers followed us, mimicking our voices, laughing, taunting. We ran until my lungs burned and my legs screamed for mercy. We finally stopped near a small clearing, trying to catch our breath. That's when we heard it, the sound of snapping branches, not behind us but in front. And then I saw Danny's eyes go wide with horror as he pointed. There, emerging from the trees, was me, another me, staring back, eyes glowing amber, and beside it, another Danny, a perfect copy but with those twisted, grinning faces. They moved in unison, mocking our every gesture, our every word. What is this? Danny whispered, his voice breaking. Before I could answer, the copy of me lunged forward, its mouth gaping wide, wider than any human mouth should, revealing rows of sharp, inhuman teeth. I screamed and turned to run, but Danny was frozen. I called his name, but he just stood there staring at the twisted version of himself, mouth agape. I ran. I didn't look back. Not until I reached my car, miles away from the campsite, breathless and shaking. I drove until I found cell service and called the police. They searched for days, but there was no sign of Danny or our campsite or any of our gear. It was like the forest swallowed it all whole. I wish I could say that's the end of it, but it's not. Last night, as I sat in my apartment, trying to convince myself it was all a nightmare, I heard it again. A whisper, garbled, twisted, and then, clear as day, my own voice, coming from just outside my window. Hey, why don't you stay, play with us, forever?